The boat slammed into the dock, and Min Seok was flung face down onto the wet planks. A guard in a black uniform kicked him in the side and tossed a knife in a plastic sheath next to him. Then a jacket was thrown, then a bag of dry rations. The engine roared, and the boat sped back out to the open sea, leaving a white wake on the dark water. Min Seok got down on his knees and watched it disappear. The number 2847 on the back of his jacket was already soaked from the spray. He pulled it over his shoulders and turned toward the shore. The beach was littered with bones, not human ones, too large, with growths along the spines, each one 1.5 meters long. Min Seok crouched down and picked up a fragment of a rib. He turned it over in his fingers. Denser than ordinary bone, more like ceramic. Calcium metabolism works differently in the local fauna. That means there are patterns here. That means this can be studied. He straightened up and slipped the fragment into his jacket pocket. For 27 years, he'd been polite, quiet. He'd yielded to his older brother in everything except work. Now work was all he had left. Somewhere in the bushes behind the beach, a branch snapped. Something large was moving through the undergrowth, slowly, confidently, like a predator that knows its prey isn't going anywhere. And at that moment, a thin, cold thread unfurled behind Min Seok's skull. Not a voice, not a sound. The sensation of text right at the back of his head. The infinite practice system has been activated. The first action is expected. Min Seok blinked. He shook his head. The thread didn't disappear. It simply settled at the bottom of his consciousness and fell silent, like a program that had gone into the background. He pulled the knife from its sheath, a cheap one, serrated. The blade was as long as his palm. The bushes ahead crackled louder. Min Seok gripped the handle more firmly and took his first step toward the shore. The island greeted him with the smell of rot and salt. The forest began 30 meters from the water. The trees stood close together, their canopies intertwining to form a solid canopy that blocked out the light. Min Seok walked along a narrow path between the trunks, counting his steps. 120 steps from the beach, he found a stream. The water flowed over the rocks, murky with a yellowish tint. He scooped up some with his palm and sniffed it. Iron, something else. It was too early to drink. He continued along the stream, up the slope. At the 200th step, the trail opened onto a clearing, and Min Seok stopped. In the middle of the clearing lay a body, a human body. A man in his 40s wearing the same gray jacket with a number on the back. Number 2801. His chest had been cut open. Not with teeth, not with claws. With something thin and precise. As if someone had cut out the ribs one by one. Min Seok crouched down beside it and forced himself to look. The engineer inside him was already at work. The edges of the cuts were smooth, about 5 millimeters wide. The depth of the cuts was consistent. This wasn't a chaotic attack. This was feeding. Something here was feeding neatly and methodically. He stood up and examined the ground around the body. Tracks, 4 toes on each paw. The distance between the prints suggested an animal weighing about 200 kilograms. The claws are not retractable. The pads are wide. It runs fast but doesn't climb trees. A ground-dwelling predator. Min Seok memorized the shape of the track and moved on. His rations are meant to last a month. He had only one knife. No shelter, no water. And somewhere nearby roamed a creature that butchered people with surgical precision. He had to find a safe place before dark. By evening, he found a rock with a hollow at its base. Not a cave, just a recess in the rock large enough to lie down in and remain hidden from the trail. Min Seok climbed inside and unwrapped his rations, crackers, dried meat, 2 packets of powdered mix, water purification tablets. He ate 1 cracker and washed it down with a sip from the canteen in his jacket. The canteen was small, a liter at most. So tomorrow's first task would be to find water. He closed his eyes and tried to think. 3 days ago, he'd been sitting in his office on the 42nd floor of the Taeyong Tower in Gangnam. He'd been drinking coffee from a white mug with the company logo. He'd been reading a report on clinical trials for a neural interface. Then Minho's people arrived. Lawyers, 3 of them. They carried a folder containing a confession to the murder of So Jae-hyun, his partner, his friend. Min-suk hadn't killed Jae-hyun, but the fingerprints on the broken glass were his, because he'd drunk from that glass the day before Jae-hyun's death in that very same lab. The lawyers gave him 6 hours. Sign a voluntary waiver of inheritance and a confession, where the case would go to trial and his mother would learn the details. Min-suk signed, not because he was afraid of the trial, because of his mother. A day later, he was standing on the pier at Heiran, an island he'd only heard about through rumors on closed forums, a private prison run by the Taeyong Group, officially an ecological reserve, unofficially a place from which no one had ever returned. Now he understood why. There was something here far more terrifying than the prison guards. The thread at the back of his neck twitched again. The system was waiting. Act 1. Min-suk opened his eyes and pulled out the knife. He ran his finger along the blade. Dull. Notches in 3 places. Soft steel. He picked up a stone from the floor of the recess and began to sharpen it, methodically, slowly. A 20-degree angle, even pressure, moving away from himself. He sharpened and counted. 1, 2, 3. On the 100th stroke, the blade grew sharper. By the 200th, he could cut a hair from his arm. A thread at the nape of his neck pulsed quietly and steadily, like the heartbeat of a foreign organism. Skill acquired, sharpening the blade, repetition running in the background. Min-suk didn't understand those words, but his hands had already memorized the angle, the pressure, and the rhythm. He put the knife away and lay on his back. Above him, through a crack in the stones, the sky was visible. Stars. Not a single light. Not a single sound of an engine. Only the wind and the distant cry of something that wasn't a bird. The morning began with pain. Min-suk woke up because his whole body had gone stiff from the stone floor. He couldn't turn his neck. His fingers were numb. He crawled out of the hollow and stood up, stretching his joints. The air was damp and warm. Fog lay between the trees like milk. First task, water. He returned to the stream he'd found yesterday. The yellowish tint was still there. Min-suk filled his canteen with water and dropped in a purification tablet. The tablet would kill bacteria but wouldn't remove heavy metals. This was a temporary solution. He needed a filter. Or he needed another source. He walked along the stream down the slope. After half a kilometer, the stream flowed into a small lake. The water in the lake was cleaner, clear. He could see the bottom down to a depth of 1 meter. Min-suk scooped up some water and tasted it. Clean, no metallic taste. He memorized the spot and marked it on the map in his head. The lake. 400 meters southeast of the cliff, a source of fresh water. On the way back, he noticed tracks, the same 4 toes, the same broad pads, but fresh, from the night. A hound had passed 20 meters from his hiding place while he slept. Min-suk looked at the tracks and thought he'd been lucky, just this once. He shouldn't count on a second chance. He spent the second day scouting. He covered the area within a kilometer's radius of the cliff. He found 3 things. The first, an abandoned lighthouse on the southwestern tip of the island, a 15-meter-tall tower, stone walls. The door had been torn off its hinges. Inside it was empty. The staircase was intact. From the top platform you could see the sea in every direction. A good spot. Second, the wreckage of a boat on the rocks below the lighthouse. Old, the hull was... but the engine is partially intact. Wires, metal, glass, materials. Third, a nest. In a crevice between 2 boulders, he found a clutch of eggs the size of a fist. The shells were thick with a greenish tint. Feathers lay nearby, long, stiff. Not bird feathers, a different texture. He took one egg and one feather. The egg was warm. That meant someone would be coming back here. Min-suk left quickly without looking back. By evening, he had moved his belongings from the rock alcove to the lighthouse. He barricaded the doorway with debris from the boat. He climbed up to the upper platform. He sat down on the floor and laid out everything he had in front of him. A knife, a sharpened sharp, a fragment of a rib from an unknown creature, an egg, a feather, a canteen of water, rations for 28 days, and a thread at the back of his head that hummed softly every time he did something for the first time. Not much, but enough to start with. The third day changed everything. Min-suk went down to the lake at dawn. He filled his canteen, he washed his face, and on the way back he came face to face with a hound. It emerged from the fog 10 meters away from him, 200 kilograms of muscle and bony plates, head held low, small eyes sunk into the folds of armored skin, jaws slightly parted. Its teeth were flat, not for tearing, but for crushing. Min-suk froze, a knife in his hand, a blade the length of his palm against a creature the size of a motorcycle. The hound took a step, then another. Min-suk stared at it and thought, bone plates on its shoulders and forehead. Its neck was short and thick. Its sides were well protected. But its lower jaw, where the throat meets the chin, the skin is thinner there. He'd seen it on the skeletons on the beach. Large skulls always had a thin area under the lower jaw. An artery must run there. The hound lunged. Min-suk struck. A single blow from bottom to top aimed under the jaw. He missed by 2 centimeters. The blade slid across the plate and veered off to the side. The hound rammed him with its body. Min-suk was sent flying backward and slammed his back into a tree. 2 ribs cracked. Pain flooded his chest like boiling water. He fell to the ground and curled up. The hound approached. She sniffed him. She snorted. And she walked away. She didn't finish him off. She wasn't hungry. She was simply removing an obstacle from her territory. Min-suk lay on the ground, breathing erratically. Every breath felt like a knife stab from within. He crawled to the beacon. He pulled himself up the stairs on his hands. He fell onto the floor of the upper landing and closed his eyes. A thread at the back of his head flared up. The blow, that very one, from bottom to top, a 2-centimeter miss. The system tore him apart. The angle of his wrist, speed of movement, point of entry. The point that was supposed to be the point of entry. 2 centimeters to the right, pressure on the grip, position of the elbow. Everything was wrong. Everything could be fixed. Min-suk fell asleep, and in his sleep he struck again and again and again, 1,000 times, 10,000. Each time the angle shifted by a micron. Each time the speed increased by a fraction of a second. By morning, he knew that strike better than his own name. The hound returned at dawn. Min-suk heard her footsteps from below, heavy, steady. She had come for the prey that was supposed to have died the night. He stood up. His ribs were burning. Every movement sent a jolt down his spine. He made his way down the stairs, holding on to the wall. He stepped out of the lighthouse. The hound was standing 20 meters away, the same one, the same plates, the same low-slung forehead. Min-suk grabbed the knife, the same man, but a different strike. The hound lunged. Min-suk stepped toward her, one motion, from bottom to top, under the lower jaw, 2 centimeters deeper than yesterday. The blade struck precisely in the soft spot and severed the artery. The hound collapsed before it could even growl. Its body slid another 2 meters across the ground and came to rest at his feet. Min-suk sat down beside it. He wiped the blade on the hound's armored hide and spoke aloud for the first time in 3 days. All right. Min-suk spent the 4th day working on the bone plates. 6 of them taken from the hound. Each was the size of his palm, 1 centimeter thick. He picked up a stone and tried to split one open. The stone cracked, the plate remained intact. He tried grinding the edge against the rock. 20 minutes later, a smooth edge appeared, sharp as a razor. An hour later, he had his first tool, a bone scalpel. Rough, without a handle, but the cutting edge held its sharpness better than his steel knife. A thread at the back of his mind recorded the process, shaping the bone, the angle of the cut, the pressure, the direction of the grind. Tonight, it would all happen again. By morning, his hands would know this material like an old friend. He made 3 more scalpels of different sizes, then a spearhead from the largest plate. He tied it to a long, straight branch with strips of hound hide. It turned out rough, but the tip pierced the wood 3 centimeters deep. That would be enough. On the 5th day, he returned to the wreckage of the boat near the lighthouse. Rust had eaten away at the hull, but some items remained inside: a coil of copper wire, 3 stainless steel bolts, a piece of glass from the dashboard, a scrap of rubber hose, and the most valuable item of all, a battery. It was dead, completely drained, and covered with a white coating, but it was a battery, a lead-acid battery. Min-suk pulled it out into the light and examined it. The casing was intact. The plates inside were most likely destroyed, but if he could find some acid... He looked at the remains of the hound, still lying in front of the lighthouse. Stomach acid. The pH is around 1 in predators of this type. Strong acid. He returned to the carcass. He cut out the stomach. He carefully slit it open. Inside was about a liter of murky liquid that smelled so that his eyes watered. He collected it in a cut-off plastic flask from a soldering kit. He poured it into the battery. It was a crazy idea, a predator's gastric juice instead of sulfuric acid. But chemistry is chemistry, acid is acid. In a day, he'd check the voltage. If he was lucky, he'd have a power source. The 6th day brought the first rain. Min-suk stood on the top platform of the lighthouse and watched as a wall of water approached from the east, gray and impenetrable. The wind struck first, then it poured. He went downstairs and checked the barricade at the door. It was holding. Water was seeping through the cracks in the walls, but wasn't flooding in. He placed everything he could under the streams: a canteen, an empty ration pack, a hound's stomach cut out and turned inside out. Fresh water, plenty of it, free. The rain fell for 4 hours. When it stopped, Min-suk had about 8 liters of clean water. He sat on the floor of the lighthouse, wet and frozen, and for the first time in a week allowed himself to think about what had happened before he came to the island. Jae-hyun, the lab on the 23rd floor, white walls, the smell of coffee and solder. They'd been working on the neural interface for 3 years. Non-invasive stimulation of neural plasticity, accelerated learning. The idea was simple. The brain learns through repetition. Neural connections strengthen every time a signal travels along the same path. Their interface was designed to mimic this repetition. 1 action, 1,000,000 virtual repetitions in a dream. 10,000 hours of practice in a week. They had developed a working prototype. Min-suk remembered how Jae-hyun had shown him the results on mice. Training time was reduced by a factor of 200. The mice navigated the maze after just 1 attempt. Then Jae-hyun said they needed clinical trials on humans. Min-suk said it was premature. Jae-hyun smiled and replied that he had already prepared everything. A week later, Jae-hyun was found dead. Another week passed, and Min-suk was standing on the Huron Pier, and the thread at the back of his neck came to life. He didn't know where it came from. He didn't know how it worked. But he was recognizing the symptoms. Accelerated learning, background repetition, skills honed in his sleep. It was their interface, alive, working, inside his head. Jae-hyun had succeeded. Min-suk closed his eyes and pressed his palms against his temples. The migraine had come on suddenly, sharp and throbbing. He'd taken on too much over the last few days, sharpening, dissection, bone processing, the anatomy of a hound, a knife strike. Each skill spun in the background, devouring his brain's resources. The system showed no mercy. It processed everything simultaneously. Blood trickled from his right nostril in a thin stream. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and forced himself to breathe steadily. He had to choose. He couldn't learn everything at once. His brain wasn't infinite. He maintenance set his priorities. Combat skills, that's first. Without them, he wouldn't survive even a month. Medicine, second. There are no doctors on the island. If he gets seriously injured, he'll die of infection. Engineering, third. But not now. Right now, it's survival. He imagined shutting down unnecessary processes one by one. Bone processing, stop. Sharpening, stop. He left only striking and anatomy. The migraine receded, not immediately, slowly, like water draining from a bathtub. An hour later, he could think. 2 hours later, he could move. He understood the rule. The system is infinite. The brain is not. It's a weapon that can kill its master. On the 7th day, he went down to the lake and found tracks. Not from a hound. Different ones. Human. Bare feet. Small size, short stride. Someone light and short had been coming to the water at night. Minsok followed the tracks into the forest. They led eastward along the shore and disappeared into a rocky area. He kept going. 200 meters further on, he found more tracks, and more, several people, at least 4, barefoot. Heading in the same direction, toward the northeastern part of the island, Minsok stopped. Prisoners, different numbers, those who had survived longer than he had. They are somewhere around here, and they're moving in a group. That means organization, a hierarchy, rules. He could follow the tracks and find them, or he could return to the lighthouse and continue his work. He chose the lighthouse, not because he was afraid of people, but because, for now, he had nothing to offer them. He'd return to them when he was ready, when he had skills more valuable than his fists. On the 8th and 9th days, he hunted, not for hounds. He hunted small game he found by the lake, something halfway between a rat and a rabbit, with a long snout and 6 legs, slow, skittish. The meat was tough but edible. He killed 3 with his spear. He butchered them. He hung some of the meat to dry in the wind at the top of the lighthouse. He cooked the rest over a fire he built from dry branches in a stone niche in the wall. Fire, his first in 9 days. Warmth and light and the smell of roasted meat. Minsok ate and felt something inside him slowly straightening out. Not hope, order. He was beginning to understand this place. A scream came from the eastern shore, high-pitched and desperate. Human. Minsok grabbed his spear and ran. His ribs still ached with every step, but over the course of a week, the system had honed his movements to be economical. Not a single unnecessary burst of speed, not a single wasted breath. He ran 400 meters through the forest and emerged onto an open slope. Down below, on the rocks by the water, stood a person, a woman, a young woman. She wore a torn gray jacket with a number on the back. In front of her were 2 hounds, one on the left, the other on the right. They were cornering the prey. The woman held a stick in her hands and was waving it. The hounds took their time. They approached slowly. They knew that their prey had nowhere to run. Behind her lay a cliff and the sea. Minsok assessed the distance. 30 meters down the slope, 2 hounds, 1 spear, 1 knife. His ribs were cracked. A good scenario for suicide. He ran downhill. The first hound turned at the sound. Minsok threw the spear, not at the body, at the eye, the only unprotected spot on the head. The bone plate tip penetrated 6 centimeters. The hound twitched and collapsed on its side. The second one turned toward him. He was already right there, the knife in his right hand, a blow from below, up under the jaw, the very same one, 10,000 repetitions in a single night. The blade slid in like butter. The hound fell at his feet. Min-suk stood between the two carcasses, catching his breath. His ribs were burning. His hands were shaking from the adrenaline, but he stood his ground. The woman looked up at him. The stick had fallen from her hands. The number 2819 was on her jacket. Min-suk wiped the knife on his pant leg and asked how long she'd been on the island. She replied that it had been 3 months, that her name was Han Ji-woo, that she didn't know why she was still alive. Ji-woo was so thin she seemed almost transparent. Her cheekbones jutted out. Her fingers were as thin as matchsticks. But her eyes were clear, fierce, and alive. She hadn't broken down after 3 months alone in the forest. Min-suk led her to the lighthouse. He gave her water and dried meat. She ate slowly, forcing herself to chew rather than swallow. Control. Even when hungry, she remained in control. Min-suk sat across from her and waited. Ji-woo finished eating and began to speak. She explained that her father was a member of the National Assembly, that Kang Min-ho had come to him with a folder and demanded he vote for a certain bill. Her father refused. 2 weeks later, Ji-woo disappeared on her way home from university. She woke up on a speedboat, then the pier, then the island. Min-suk listened in silence. Kang Min-ho, his older brother, the same handwriting, the same methods. Ji-woo didn't know who he was. She didn't know his last name. He went by a number only. But when she said the name Min-ho, he felt his fingernails dig into his palms. He unclenched his fists and asked if she knew where the other prisoners were. Ji-woo nodded. North Cape. There's a group there, about 30 people. A former soldier is keeping them together. She'd been hiding from them because there are some among them who can't be trusted. Min-suk asked why. Ji-woo replied that she'd seen 2 members of the group stoned to death a loner who'd come asking for food. Not for the food, just because they could. Min-suk said nothing. He pulled a bundle of bone scalpels from the corner and began working on a new spearhead. Ji-woo watched his hands. She asked what the material was. He explained. Bone plates from a hound, denser than steel, lighter than aluminum. They stay sharp for a week. Ji-woo picked up one scalpel and twirled it between her fingers. She asked if she could stay. Min-suk said the lighthouse wasn't his property. She could live there if she agreed to work. Ji-woo asked what she needed to do. Min-suk replied that, for starters, he needed someone who could do math. He had data on the area, distances, water sources, the hound's routes. It's all in his head. He needs someone to put it down on paper, or rather, on bark. There's no paper. Ji-woo said she knew 4 languages and had a degree in political science. Min-suk said that wouldn't be useful yet, but her ability to organize information would come in handy right now. She smiled for the first time in 3 months. For the next 3 days, they worked together. Ji-woo proved to be quick. She listened to his descriptions of the territory and plotted them on a makeshift map carved with a knife onto a flat piece of bark. Min-suk dictated. The lake is here, the stream with heavy metals is here, the hound's lair is presumably here, the hound's dawn and dusk routes are here and here, the nest of unknown creatures is here, the northern cape with a group of prisoners is here, the lighthouse is here, the wreckage of the boat is here. Ji-woo cut the bark into even strips and marked each feature with a notch of a specific shape. 3 days later, they had a map of the island, rough, incomplete, but their first. Min-suk looked at it and didn't see an island. He saw a system: entrances, exits, bottlenecks, resources, threats, routes. His brain worked just as it had in the Terion Bio office when he was designing the architecture of a neural network. Only instead of data, there were hounds. Instead of servers, a lighthouse. Instead of users, people trying not to die. On the 14th day after landing, Min-suk decided to head for the Northern Cape. Not alone. He took Ji-woo with him. She knew the way, and she knew the people to be wary of. They set out at dawn and walked for 3 hours along the trails on the eastern shore. Min Sok carried a spear. Ji Woo carried 2 bone knives he had made for her. Lightweight, easy for a small hand to hold. By noon, they reached the northern cape. Min Sok spotted the camp from a distance. Tents made of animal hides and branches, bonfires, a fence of sharpened stakes. Pirates, but functional. 2 men stood at the entrance, large men. They held wooden clubs with stones wrapped in hide. They saw Min Sok and Ji Woo and blocked their path. One of them shouted into the camp. A minute later, a man of medium height, stocky, short-cropped hair. He moved like a spring, every step precise, economical, a soldier to the core. Pak Junil, a former Special Forces major. He looked at Min Sok, at the spear, at the bone tip, at the knife. He asked who he was and where he was from. Min Sok gave his number, 2847. Park asked how long he'd been on the island. Min Sok replied that it had been 2 weeks. Park looked at the spearhead once more and asked what it was made of. Min Sok replied that it was made from a hound's bone plate. Park fell silent. In 2 years on the island, none of his men had thought to use hound bones as material. They had fought with sticks and stones. Min Sok returned 2 weeks later with the best weapons they had. Park invited him inside. The Wolves' camp at North Cape, 32 people, 23 men, 9 women, ages ranging from 19 to 56, all wearing gray jackets with numbers on them. Min Sok looked at them and saw their ailments. One man was limping, a dislocation that hadn't been set properly, so it had healed crookedly. A woman was holding her arm outstretched, a forearm fracture, a splint made of sticks, applied crookedly. The bone would heal out of alignment. A young man by the campfire was coughing incessantly, a deep, wet cough, a lower respiratory tract infection. Without treatment, pneumonia in a week, death in 2. Min Sok turned to Park and said he could help. Park asked how exactly. Min Sok approached the limping man. He asked him to sit down. He examined his leg. A chronic dislocation of the knee joint. The kneecap was displaced. Min Sok took the leg in both hands. Park and his 2 men braced themselves. Min Sok made a single movement, quick, precise. A crack. The man screamed. Then he fell silent. Then he wiggled his leg. It hurt, but the kneecap had snapped back into place. For the first time in 6 months, his leg bent properly. Min Sok turned to the woman with the fracture. He removed the splint. He examined it. The bone had already begun to heal incorrectly. It needed to be broken again and set straight. He explained this to her calmly and quietly. She looked at him for a long time, then she nodded. He broke it. She didn't scream. She just bit her lip until it bled. He set the bone correctly. He applied a new splint made of hound bone plates. Straight, rigid. He wrapped it tightly with strips of hide. He went to the coughing young man last. He placed his palm on the boy's forehead, hot. He listened to his breathing, pressing his ear to the boy's chest. Rails in the lower lobes of both lungs. Not good. He needs antibiotics, which he doesn't have. Min Sok told Pak that he would return, that he needed to pick something up from the lighthouse. Pak asked why he needed to go back if he could stay. Min Sok replied that his lab was at the lighthouse. Park raised an eyebrow. What kind of lab could there be on the island after just 2 weeks? Min Sok didn't bother to explain. He said he'd be back by morning and that the guy with the cough should drink hot water and stay in bed without getting up. Park watched his back as he walked away, silently, with an expression that Min Sok didn't see but Ji Woo did. She said later that Park looked like a man who, for the first time in 2 years, had seen something new. Min Sok ran back to the lighthouse, 3 hours on foot, an hour and a half at a run. His ribs protested. He didn't listen. At the lighthouse, he gathered what he needed: hound bile, remaining gastric juice, tissue samples, bone scalpels, and something he'd found 2 days earlier on the slope leading down to the lake. Mold, greenish, growing on dead bark. He scraped off a thin layer and placed it in a flask fragment. Mold, an antibiotic. Penicillin was a mold. He didn't know exactly what species was growing on this island, but he knew biochemistry. He knew how to test for antibacterial activity. And the system knew it now too. Overnight, it would process everything he remembered about microbiology from his MIT course. Every lecture, every textbook, every lab assignment. By morning, he would know this not as a student, but as a practitioner. He ran out of the lighthouse at dawn with a leather backpack on his back, mold in one pocket, bone tools in the other, a knife on his belt, a spear in his hand. 27 years of politeness, that's all that remained. Min-suk returned to the northern cape around noon. The boy with the cough had gotten worse. His breathing was wheezing. His lips were turning blue. His temperature was over 40. Min-suk crouched down beside him and unwrapped the bundle. Mold, a green, slimy mass on a piece of bark. People gathered around and watched. Park stood behind them with his arms crossed over his chest. Min-suk worked in silence. He needed to extract the active ingredient. At the Taryong Biolab, this would have taken an hour using a centrifuge and a chromatograph. Here, he had a bone pestle and a fire. He ground up the mold. He poured boiling water over it in a hollowed-out wooden bowl. He let it steep. He strained it through a piece of fabric from his jacket. The result was a cloudy, greenish-yellow liquid. He didn't know exactly what was in it. He didn't know the dosage. He didn't know the side effects. But he knew that without treatment, the boy would die in 2 days. He made him drink half of it. The boy threw up 10 minutes later. Min-suk forced him to drink the other half. An hour later, the fever hadn't changed. After 3 hours, it dropped by half a degree. By evening, the boy's breathing was slightly more even. The wheezing remained, but the whistling sound was gone. Min-suk sat nearby and counted his breaths. 24 per minute. That's a lot. But yesterday it was 32. He prepared a second dose from the remaining mold. He gave it to him for the night. In the morning, the boy was asleep. He wasn't tossing and turning. He wasn't moaning. He was just sleeping. His lips were pink. His breathing was 18 breaths per minute. Min-suk stepped out of the tent and sat down by the campfire. Park walked over and sat down next to him. He was silent for a long time. Then he said one word. How? Min-suk replied that the mold contained substances that killed bacteria, that this had been known for over 100 years, that they needed to find a place where this mold grew consistently and harvest it regularly. Park looked at him as if he were from another planet. Then he asked what Min-suk had been before coming to the island. Min-suk said he was an engineer. Park grunted and asked no more questions. Min-suk stayed at the Northern Cape for 3 days. During that time, he accomplished more than the wolves had in 2 years. He examined all 32 people. He found issues requiring attention in 9 of them: a finger fracture that had healed crookedly, an abscess on the thigh that needed to be lanced and drained, 2 cases of chronic diarrhea from contaminated water. 5 people had fungal infections on their feet. He treated them with whatever was available. He lanced the abscess with a bone scalpel and rinsed it with a solution of boiled seawater. He applied a bandage made of clean strips of cloth. He explained that it needed to be changed twice a day. For the people with diarrhea, he gave them charcoal from the campfire, ground into a powder and mixed with water. Primitive, but it works. A sorbent is a sorbent. The fungus is trickier. It thrives in an acidic environment. He remembered hound bile, acidic, caustic. He diluted it 1 part to 10 parts water. He applied it to the affected areas. It stung, but after a day the redness had subsided. People came to him one after another, first with illnesses, then with questions, then just to sit nearby. the quiet guy with the number 2847 who'd arrived 2 weeks ago and could kill hounds with a single blow and heal people with green mold porridge. Who was he? Min-suk could feel the atmosphere around him changing, how people's gazes were shifting. Not hostile, not suspicious, expectant. These people were waiting for someone who would tell them what to do next. Park Jun-il had been that person for 2 years. He kept them together with force and discipline, but he couldn't cure them. He couldn't explain why the water from the stream caused diarrhea. He couldn't make a weapon better than a stick with a stone. Min-suk could, and that changed everything. On the 3rd day at the camp, Min-suk met Lee So-yeon, number 2803. She came to him in the evening while he was sitting by the campfire sharpening a new scalpel. She sat down next to him and silently watched his hands for about 5 minutes. Then she said she was a doctor, a ship's doctor in the merchant marine. Min-suk looked at her, about 29 years old, short hair, calm eyes, hands without a tremor, even after a year on the island. He asked why she hadn't been treating people at the camp. So-yeon replied that she had, for the first 6 months. Then it all ran out. Bandages, antiseptic, painkillers, everything she'd brought in her pockets. When you have no instruments and no medicine, you're not a doctor. You're just a person who knows exactly what's killing your patient. Min-suk nodded. Then he handed her a bone scalpel. So-yeon took it. She turned it over in her hands. She ran her finger along the blade. She looked at Min-suk with an expression he'd only seen on Jae-hyun's face when he received unexpected experimental results. She asked what it was made of. He explained. She asked if he could make a set. Different sizes, different shapes, for different types of incisions. Min-suk said he could, but he needed to know which hand she used. So-yeon looked at her palms. Short fingers, a wide palm. She said that standard scalpels had always been uncomfortable for her. Too long, the handles were too thin. Min-suk made a mental note. That night, lying in the tent, he closed his eyes and imagined a set of instruments tailored to So-yeon's hands. Handles 5 millimeters wider than standard, shorter blades. The balance shifted toward the tip for precision with a short lever arm. The system took hold and ran with it. By morning, he knew every tool down to the micron. But Park Jun-il wasn't satisfied. Min-suk could tell by the way the major looked at the line forming around the campfire. People were heading toward Min-suk, not toward him. Over 2 years, Park had built a system that worked, rigid, hierarchical. He was at the top. His 3 lieutenants were below him. The rest were subordinate. Food was distributed according to contribution. Those who hunted ate first. Those who were weak ate last. The system was harsh, but it had kept 32 people alive for 2 years. And then a quiet guy with a bone knife shows up and starts handing out things for free. Medical care, tools, knowledge. For free. No hierarchy, no debt. This was destroying Park's hierarchy, not because Min-suk wanted it to, but because people were starting to think differently. Why submit to power when there's a man who gives you what you need simply because he can? Park came to see Min-suk on the evening of the 4th day. He sat across from him, looked him in the eyes, said it was time for him to leave, that he'd done a good deed, that the boy with the cough was recovering, that he could take his tools and return to the lighthouse. Min-suk understood. This wasn't a request, it was an order. A polite one, but an order nonetheless. Park couldn't kill him in front of the people he'd just cured, but he could ask him to leave, and if Min-suk refused, the next step wouldn't involve words. Min-suk stood up and said he'd leave in the morning, and that if anyone from the camp wanted to come to the lighthouse for treatment, he wouldn't turn them away. Park remained silent. That silence meant more than any answer. Min-suk packed his things. Ji-woo was waiting for him at the camp entrance. She had heard everything. Min-sok told her that everything was fine, that this was how it was supposed to be, that Park was doing what he believed was right for his people. Ji-woo replied that Park was an idiot. Min-sok said no. Park was a soldier. He knew only one way to keep people together: fear and order. It wasn't his fault that he hadn't been taught any other way. They returned to the lighthouse by nightfall. So-yeon was waiting at the door. She had left Park's camp an hour before they did, silently, without permission. She just grabbed her things and left. Min-sok looked at her and asked if she'd get in trouble. So-yeon replied that she'd been at the camp for a year and that Park had never respected her as a doctor. To him, she was just a member of the support staff, a useful tool, not a person. Min-sok nodded and opened the lighthouse door. Now there were 3 of them: an engineer, a strategist, a doctor. The lighthouse felt cramped. Fine. The next morning, Min-sok spread Ji-woo's map out on the floor and sat down in front of it. So-yeon and Ji-woo sat down beside him. He said that the lighthouse was a temporary refuge. The walls were thin. There was only one door. The upper deck was exposed to the wind. If a pack of hounds came, they'd hold out for an hour at most. He needed to fortify the lighthouse, or find a better place. But first, he needed to understand the island as a whole. He knew the southern coast, part of the east. The north was Park's territory. The west was unknown. So-yeon said she'd heard from people at the camp about the western hills. There was something there that wasn't a hound, something that howls at night. Park's people called them the mourners. No one had seen them, only heard them, and those who got too close came back with blood in their ears and cracked ribs. Min-sok looked at the map. The western hills, a blank spot. He took a bone knife and carved a question mark into the bark, a symbolic mark. The weepers, a sound that shatters bones. Interesting. He looked up at So-yeon, then at Ji-woo. He said he would head west tomorrow, alone. So-yeon asked why he was going alone. Min-sok replied that if what he heard were to break his ribs, it would be better for it to be his ribs than someone else's. Ji-woo said that was stupid. Min-sok agreed, but he went alone anyway. The western hills began 2 kilometers from the lighthouse. There were non-existent. Min-sok made his way through the undergrowth, parting the branches with his spear. The ground rose, the trees thinned out, the rocks grew larger. After an hour's walk, he emerged onto an open plateau covered with dry, yellow grass. The silence here was different, not like the forest, not like the sea. Flat, empty, like in a soundproof room. Min-sok stopped and listened. The wind, the grass, his own breathing. Nothing else. He kept going. The plateau stretched eastward. Dry grass crunched under his feet. After half a kilometer, he saw the first bone, a human one, a skull, clean, white. No bite marks, no impact cracks, just fine, spiderweb-like cracks radiating from the base, like on a pane of glass struck from the inside. Min-sok crouched down and examined it. Microcracks all over the surface, not mechanical damage, resonance. This skull had been shattered by vibration. He put it back and moved on. 100 meters further on, 3 more skulls, the same cracks, the same spiderweb patterns. Ribs nearby, broken. All in one spot, the sternum. As if something had struck the chest not from the outside, but from the inside. The bones burst from internal pressure, a sound wave. Min-sok stood up and looked around. The plateau stretched toward a rocky ridge to the west. Dark crevices ran between the rocks, layers. He didn't go any closer. Instead, he sat down on a rock and began to think. The whalers, creatures that use sound as a weapon. The frequency is low enough to penetrate tissue, powerful enough to shatter bones. Infrasound, or the very low frequency sound range, below 20 hertz. The human ear cannot hear it, but the body can feel it. Pressure in the chest, nausea, loss of orientation. At high intensity, burst blood vessels and broken bones. He knew this from his acoustics course, in theory. Now he was about to find out in practice. He heard it 4 minutes into the wait. Not with his ears, with his body. A low, deep rumble, as if the earth were rumbling. Pressure in his chest, mild, bearable, far away. He looked at the cliffs. Nothing was moving. The rumble subsided. Then it returned. Slightly louder, slightly closer. Min-suk felt his teeth vibrating, a slight tremor in his jaw. His fingertips went numb. He stood up and began to back away, slowly. Don't run. Running attracts predators. Back away, calmly. The rumbling grew louder. Now he could feel it in his ribs, the very ribs that had cracked from the hound's blow. They resonated like a tuning fork. The pain was strange, not sharp, deep, as if his bones were ringing from within. Min-suk quickened his pace. A creature emerged from a crevice between the rocks. He managed to turn around and catch a glimpse of it. Long, 2 meters at the withers, slender, an almost serpentine body on 4 legs. Its skin was gray, white, and translucent. Dark lines of blood vessels were visible beneath it. Its head was elongated, like an anteater's. No eyes. Not a single eye. Instead, on either side of its head were 2 membranes, large, round, pulsating. It opened its mouth. There were no teeth, no tongue, only a throat, wide, like a funnel. And a sound poured out of that funnel. Min-suk didn't hear it. He felt it, a blow to the chest. Not a physical one, a pressure wave. His ribs cracked. They didn't break, but they cracked. He fell to his knees. His vision darkened. Blood flowed from his nose, not from the system, from the sound. The Mornis took a step toward him. She opened her mouth wider. Min-suk jumped up and ran. Not calmly, not steadily. He ran the way a man runs who is going to die in 3 seconds. Behind him, the wave struck the ground where he had just been standing. The grass within a 2-meter radius lay flat. The rock beneath it cracked. Min-suk ran down the slope toward the tree line. The trees, a dense environment. Sound disperses, it reflects, it loses focus. He burst into the forest and fell behind a thick tree trunk. He lay there and listened. The rumble subsided. The mourner did not follow him. She remained on the plateau, her beast on her territory. Min-suk lay there for about 20 minutes. Then he got up, his ribs ached. The old fractures from the hound made themselves felt again. The nosebleed had stopped. He wiped his face with his sleeve and walked back toward the lighthouse, slowly, thinking. The mourners, eyeless. They navigate by sound. The membranes on her head are her ears, large and complex. She sees the world through echoes, like a bat, only the other way around. A bat listens to its own reflection. The Mornis listens to everything around her and strikes with directed sound. Infrasound. The resonant frequency of the human body is about 7 Hz. His ribs resonate at other frequencies. She selects the frequency to match her target, an adaptive weapon. He remembered the bones on the plateau, skulls with spiderwebs of cracks, ribs burst from the inside. Each time, the frequency had been chosen perfectly. This isn't a mindless predator. It's a biological sonar emitter with adaptive modulation. The engineer in him was in awe. The survivalist in him reminded him that there would be time for awe later, if there was a later. He returned to the lighthouse by evening. So-yeon saw the blood on his face and sat him down on the floor. She examined him, his ribs, his nose, his ears. She asked what had happened. Min-suk told her. So-yeon listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked how he planned to deal with it. Min-suk said he wasn't going to, not yet. For now, he wanted to understand the frequencies, range, directionality. If the sound is directional, that means it has blind spots. If there are blind spots, that means you can get close. If you can get close, that means you can study it. So-yeon shook her head and said he was crazy. Min-seok replied that he wasn't, that the crazy ones are those who aren't curious. Ji-woo sat in the corner and drew on bark. She added the western plateau to the map, the zone of the weeping women, the edge of the forest. Min-seok looked and nodded. The map was filling with details. The island was becoming clearer. That night, he lay on the floor of the lighthouse and closed his eyes. The system activated, but not as usual. Usually, it reviewed physical skills, a knife strike, sharpening a blade, a surgical suture. Now it was reviewing observations. The membranes on a weeper's head, their size, shape, pulsation frequency, the throat's funnel, width, depth, the angle of the mouth's opening before the attack, the direction of the sound wave, the pattern of the trampled grass, the radius of the impact. All of this played over and over, forming a model, a three-dimensional one, a dynamic one. He could rotate it in his mind, zoom in, cut through it. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It turned a single observation into 1,000, a single glance into an X-ray. By morning, Min-seok knew the weeper's anatomy better than the creature knew itself. And he knew its weakness, the membranes, the auditory organs on her head. They were unprotected. The weeper couldn't cover her ears because without them she was blind, and if he struck the membranes with sound, her own weapon, the resonance frequency of the membrane was different from that of bone, thinner, softer, easier to destroy. A sound source of the right frequency is needed. A resonator is needed. Min-seok opened his eyes and sat up, the hound's bone plates, dense, resonant. If he carved out the right shape and struck it like a tuning fork, you can produce a sound of a specific frequency. You have to choose the right size and thickness. He stood up. He took out the plates. He began to work. So-yeon woke up to the sound of tapping and looked at him. She asked what time it was. Min-seok replied that he didn't know, but that he needed her help. He needed to test the frequency response of the bone plates, and for that, he needed someone with good hearing. So-yeon sat up and rubbed her eyes. She asked if it could wait until dawn. Min-seok thought for a moment. He said yes, but no longer than that. The experiments took 3 days. Min-seok carved 12 tuning forks of various sizes from the bone plates. Each produced its own tone. So-yeon listened and described them. High, low, medium, ringing, dull. Min-seok classified them and looked for a pattern. Thickness determined the fundamental tone. Length determined the volume. Shape determined the directionality. By the 3rd day, he had a set of 5 tuning forks covering a range from 500 to 5,000 hertz. This isn't infrasound. The mourner's voice strikes lower, much lower. But he didn't need to replicate her weapon. He needed to hit the resonant frequency of her membrane, and the membrane was thin, high frequency. In theory, one of his tuning forks should match. In theory. The only way to verify it is in practice. Min-seok gathered the tuning forks into a leather pouch and looked westward, toward the hills, at the cliffs behind which an eyeless creature with a bone-crushing voice was waiting. So-yeon asked when he would go. Min-seok replied, "Tomorrow." Ji-woo said she would go with him. Min-seok began to refuse. Ji-woo cut him off and said she needed to see the mourner. She needed to know how she moved. Because if she too knew everything Min-seok knew, there would be 2 people on the island who understood the threat, not just one. And if Min-seok died, someone would have to bring the information back. Min-seok looked at her. 24 years old, 3 months alone in the forest. She hadn't broken. He nodded. They set out at dawn. They reached the plateau in 2 hours. Min-seok placed the tuning forks in a row on the rocks. Ji-woo stayed at the edge of the forest. The instructions were simple. If he ran, she ran first. If he fell, she didn't come back. Ji-woo didn't argue. Minsok stepped out onto the plateau. Silence. The same flat, oppressive silence. He walked to the middle and stopped. He waited. 5 minutes later, a rumble. The same one. Low, deep. Pressure in his chest. He saw a silhouette emerge from a crevice. The same mourner, or perhaps another. Tall, white, eyeless. The membranes on her head pulsed. She walked toward him slowly, confidently. Minsok took out the first tuning fork, the highest pitch. He struck it with his knife. A ringing, clear sound echoed across the plateau. The mourner stopped. The membranes twitched, not from pain, from surprise. She had never heard such a sound from prey. Minsok struck the second tuning fork, lower, louder. The mourner shook her head. The membranes contracted. Discomfort, not pain, but discomfort. Minsok took note. The second tuning fork was closer, but not quite right. He struck the third one. The mourner took a step back. The membranes trembled. The sound was within range, close, very close to the resonant frequency. The mourner opened her mouth and struck. A pressure wave. Minsok fell and rolled aside. The wave passed by, 2 meters to the left. She missed. Because the tuning fork's sound had thrown off her calibration, she couldn't pinpoint his position while her membranes were vibrating from the foreign sound. Minsok jumped up. He grabbed the third tuning fork. He ran toward the forest. The weeper struck again. The wave tore up the ground 3 meters behind him. He flew into the trees. He fell next to Ji-woo. Both lay there, breathing. A minute later, Minsok sat up. He looked at the tuning fork in his hand. He smiled. His first smile in 2.5 weeks. So-yeon was right. He was crazy. But now he knew how to blind the eyeless predator. The third tuning fork. Frequency around 2000 hertz, length 12 centimeters, 4 millimeters thick. He needed to make 10 more like this. And he needed to find a way to amplify the sound. He needed a resonator, a bell, like a mourner's, only man-made. He could already picture it in his mind, a bone trumpet made from a hound's femur, hollow, long, with a flared end, like a horn, or like a weapon. They returned to the lighthouse. Min-seok sat down by the wall and took out Ji-woo's notes. He added some information. The mourner, infrasound. The membranes are sensitive to a frequency of about 2000 hertz. A directed sound attack loses accuracy when the membranes are subjected to external vibration. The dead zone is approximately 2 meters from the axis of a direct hit. So-yeon looked at the notes and said it looked like a medical chart. Min-seok replied that it was exactly that. A medical chart for a patient named Hera Island. The diagnosis is still unclear, but he is already recording the symptoms. Min-seok spent 3 days building the horn. The hound's femur turned out to be the perfect blank, hollow inside, thick walls, 40 centimeters long. He scraped out the bone marrow with a stick wrapped in cloth. He reamed one end with a scalpel, removing the inner layer millimeter by millimeter. He narrowed the other end. He inserted a third-size tuning fork into the narrow end and secured it with strips of hide. The result was an instrument resembling a hunting horn, only instead of the lips, the sound was produced by striking the tuning fork. He went out onto the lighthouse platform and struck the tuning fork with his knife. The sound burst from the bell in a directed stream, loud, sharp, clear. So-yeon covered her ears and shouted for him to stop. Ji-woo stood below at the foot of the lighthouse and said it could be heard at least 200 meters away. Min-seok put the horn away and looked westward toward the hills. In 2 days, he would test it on a female bird. But first, he needed to solve another problem. Food was running out. Their rations had run out 4 days ago. Small game by the lake appeared only sporadically. 3 people can't survive on occasional hunts. They needed a system. Min-seok went down to the wreckage of the boat and spent the whole day there. He was looking for something he'd seen during his first inspection, but had overlooked. He found it. A spool of fishing line, thin, strong nylon, 3 meters long. Along with it was a rusty hook caught on the hull. Just one, but one was a start. He made a fishing rod out of a straight branch. He carved 4 more hooks from bone plates, but he heated them over the fire, bending them while they were red hot on the coals. The bone hooks were rougher than steel ones, but they held their shape and didn't break. In the evening, he went down to the cliffs on the southern shore and cast the line into the water. 20 minutes later, he pulled a fish out, silvery with red fins, 1 kilogram. An hour later, 2 more. Min-suk gutted the fish on the rocks and thought about how the ocean surrounding the island was an unlimited source of protein. He needed nets. He needed traps. He needed a smokehouse for storage. He returned to the lighthouse with 3 fish and a plan. So-yeon cooked the fish over the coals. They ate in silence. It was the best meal they'd had in 3 weeks. The next day, 2 people came to the lighthouse, a man and a woman from Park's camp. The man had an abscess, and Min-suk changed his bandage. The woman had a broken arm and a splint. They had come for help. Min-suk examined both of them. The abscess was healing cleanly. The flourish was healing properly. He replaced the bandage and tightened the splint. Then he gave them some fish. They ate greedily. They didn't catch fish at Paka's camp. They had neither fishing line nor hooks, only the meat of small game and roots they dug out of the ground. The man asked if they could come back again. Min-suk said they could. The woman asked if she could stay. Min-suk looked at her. She'd been on the island for over a year. He said she could stay if she was willing to work. She nodded. 4 of them. The lighthouse was growing. The 20th day on the island, Min-suk went to the mourners with a megaphone, alone. Ji-woo and So-yeon stayed at the lighthouse. He walked through the forest, climbed up to the plateau, and stood in an open clearing. He waited. 7 minutes later, a rumbling sound, that familiar pressure in his chest. A mourner emerged from the crevice. The same one or a different one, impossible to tell. Eyeless, white, her membranes pulsed. She walked toward him with confidence. Min-suk raised the megaphone. He struck the tuning fork. The sound burst from the bone horn and struck the mourner in the head. The result exceeded all expectations. The mourner stopped dead in her tracks. The membranes on her head trembled violently. She jerked her head to the left, to the right. She tried to open her mouth to attack. The sound came out but veered off to the side. A shockwave tore up the ground 15 meters away from Min-suk. A miss, a complete miss. Min-suk struck again, and again, and again. The mourner backed away. Its membranes quivered. A clear liquid began to ooze from them. It turned and ran back toward the cliffs. Its long, white body flashed between the rocks and vanished. Min-suk stood alone on the plateau, the horn in his hand. His heart was pounding, but he stood his ground. He hadn't killed it, but he'd forced it to flee. The creature that killed people with sound had fled from sound. The thread at the back of his neck hummed. New data, a new model. The megaphone's effective range was about 30 meters. The whaler's disorientation lasted 3 to 4 seconds from a single blast, up to 20 seconds from a series of blasts. The membranes release fluid when overloaded. A pain threshold exists. It can be exceeded. Min-suk put away the megaphone and walked back to me. He now had his first effective defense against the island's second predator. On the 22nd day, a girl came to the lighthouse. Min-suk saw her from the upper platform, a small figure on the trail from the eastern shore. She was walking slowly, staggering. He went downstairs and walked out to meet her. She was about 19 but looked 16, thin, pale. Her hair was dirty and tangled into knots. She wasn't wearing a jacket, just a torn t-shirt and pants cut off at the knees. He couldn't see her ID number. She stopped 10 meters away from him and stared. She didn't speak. She just stared. Her eyes were large, dark, and empty. Min-suk asked her name. She didn't answer. He asked how long she'd been on the island.
Silence. He crouched down to be shorter, less threatening. He told her it was safe here, that he had food and water, that no one would hurt her. The girl took a step forward, then another. Then her legs gave out and she fell. Min-seok caught her a split second before she hit the rocks. She was light, about 40 kilograms, dehydrated, exhausted. He carried her to the lighthouse. So-yeon examined her. Pulse, 120. Blood pressure was low. Her skin was dry. Her lips were chapped. No fever, no infection, just hunger and thirst. They gave her a few sips of water. They gave her fish broth, warm and thin. She drank and said nothing. By evening, she had fallen asleep on a bed of dry grass in the corner of the lighthouse. Min-seok sat against the wall and watched her. So-yeon sat down next to him and quietly said that the girl had scars on her wrists, old ones and new ones. Min-seok clenched his teeth. Someone had hurt her, or she had hurt herself, or both. The girl woke up at dawn. She drank some water. She ate a piece of dried fish, and she said one word. Hae-rin. Her name. Yoon Hae-rin. Min-seok froze. Yoon. Not a common last name, but not rare either. He asked cautiously if she knew the name So Jae-hyun. Hae-rin looked at him. Her eyes, which had been empty, filled with something, not tears, something deeper. She nodded. She whispered that he was her father. Min-seok felt the ground give way beneath his feet. Jae-hyun, his partner, his friend, the one whose fingerprints were on the glass, the one whose death had been pinned on Min-seok. He had a daughter, and she was here on this island. He asked how she'd ended up here. Hae-rin spoke softly, almost in a whisper. The words came out one by one, slowly, as if each one took effort. She'd been at home when the men came. Her father's security guard, a former bodyguard, took her away. He said they wanted to kill her, that the only safe place was the island because no one would look for her there. He brought her by boat at night, left her enough food to last 3 months, said he'd come back. He never did. That was 8 months ago. She'd been surviving on her own in the forest, eating roots and eggs from nests, hiding from the hounds. She hid from people, from everyone. Min-seok listened and felt his fingernails dig into his palms again. Min-ho, his brother. He killed Jae-hyun. He set Min-seok up and tried to kill a 19-year-old girl, the daughter of the man who had devoted 10 years of his career to him. He unclenched his fists, looked at Hae-rin, said he knew her father, that he'd worked with him, that Jae-hyun was the best scientist he'd ever met. Hae-rin looked at him and said nothing. Then she asked in a whisper if he knew who had killed her father. Min-seok said he did, and that he would return to the mainland and take everything from that man. Hae-rin nodded once, briefly, and didn't say another word until evening. 5 people in the lighthouse. Min-seok, So-yeon, Ji-woo, a woman with a broken bone named Jung-mi-yeon, and Hae-rin. The lighthouse was bursting at the seams. There wasn't enough space. There was barely enough water for the 5 of them, and fish, too. Min-seok stood on the top landing and looked down at the lighthouse from above. Stone, 15 meters high, 1 entrance, 3 floors if you count the stair landings. The lower floor could be expanded, build a stone wall, create a second room. They needed mortar. They needed helping hands. They needed time. He went down and told So-yeon that they needed to build. So-yeon replied that she was a doctor, not a builder. Min-seok said that on this island everyone was a builder, or everyone was dead. So-yeon looked at him. Then she rolled up her sleeves. They began hauling stones. The construction took 2 weeks. Min-seok worked like a machine. Everyone carried stones, even Hae-rin, in silence, 3 or 4 at a time, small ones, but she carried them.
He made the mortar from clay found by the lake mixed with ash from the campfires. It was primitive, but after drying in the sun, it held firmly. Wall after wall, block after block. By the end of the second week, 2 rooms had been added to the lighthouse. One for living quarters, the other for work. Min-suk called it a laboratory, and So-yeon snorted. A stone room 2 by 3 meters with shelves made from the wreckage of a boat. On the shelves stood scraps of flasks containing tissue samples, bone scalpels lined up in a row, tuning forks, mold in 3 jars made from the shell's large eggs, a megaphone hung on the wall. Not a museum, not a Taryong biolab, but a workspace. His workspace. On the 35th day on the island, what Min-suk had been waiting for and fearing happened. Park Jun-il came to the lighthouse. He wasn't alone. He was with 5 people. They were armed with clubs and stone knives. Min-suk went out to meet them with a spear. So-yeon stood behind him. Ji-woo was on the lighthouse platform with the megaphone. Park stopped 10 meters away and looked at the outbuildings, at the walls, at the door made of thick branches bound with hide, at the smoke from the fire inside. He asked how long it had been since it had become so cozy here. Min-suk didn't answer the question. He asked why Park had come. Park said that over the past 2 weeks, 4 people had left his camp. 2 had come here. 2 had disappeared. His men had seen them heading toward the lighthouse. Park said this was disrupting order, that he couldn't let people leave. If everyone started leaving for whoever promised more, the camp would be gone in a month, and without the camp, everyone would die. Min-suk listened. Park was saying the right things, from a military standpoint, from the standpoint of a commander who had kept people together in hell for 2 years. He was responsible for 32 people, now for 28, and every person who left was a crack in the wall. Min-suk said he hadn't lured people away, that they had come on their own. Park replied that it didn't matter. What matters is the result. Min-suk said he could offer something else, not competition, cooperation. The lighthouse and North Cape work together. The lighthouse provides medicine, tools, and weapons. North Cape provides manpower and security. Park remained silent. The 5 men behind him exchanged glances. One of them was the very same man with the abscess whom Min-suk had treated. He stood there, silently staring at his commander. Park turned and walked away, without saying a word, neither yes nor no. Min-suk knew this wasn't the end, that Park would return. The only question was when, and with what decision. Day 38. A pack came into the forest behind the lighthouse. Not just 1 hound, 5. Min-suk woke up to the sound, a low growl, multiple growls, 5 voices. He got up and peered through a crack in the wall. 5 dark silhouettes in the morning mist, moving together in unison. A pack. They weren't hunting alone. They'd gone out to hunt as a group. And they were heading toward the lighthouse. Min-suk woke everyone up, So-yeon, Ji-woo, Mi-yeon, Hae-rin. He grabbed a spear and 2 bone knives, a megaphone. He assigned roles. So-yeon and Hae-rin went upstairs. Mi-yeon went to the door with the throwing stones. Ji-woo, with the megaphone, took his position on the second platform. He went outside alone. The pack stopped 30 meters away. 5 pairs of small eyes stared at him from the fog. The leader was in front, larger than the rest. The bone plates on its shoulders were thicker and darker, an old beast. Min-suk assessed the formation. The leader in the center, 2 on the flanks, 2 in the rear. A herding tactic, like wolves. He couldn't fight 5 of them. He could kill 1, maybe 2, but 5 meant certain death. He shouted to Ji-woo, the megaphone. Ji-woo struck the tuning fork. The sound cut through the fog. The hounds flinched, not from pain, but from surprise. The megaphone was tuned to the frequency of the mourner's membranes, not the hounds. But any loud, sharp sound is frightening. The leader backed away. The 2 on the flanks froze. Min-suk struck again, and once more, rhythmically, like a danger signal. The leader spun around and scampered into the woods. 4 followed him. The pack was gone. For now. Min-seok returned to the lighthouse and sat down on the floor. His hands were shaking. 5 hounds. If it weren't for the megaphone, he looked at the walls of the lighthouse. Stone, sturdy. But the door was just branches and hide. 1 blow and the pack would be inside. He needed a real door. He needed a real wall around the perimeter. He needed a fortress. He'd been working on the perimeter for 10 days. Now he had help. 3 more people from Park's camp had come to the lighthouse. A man named Hwang Tae-soo, a former bricklayer from Busan. He ended up on the island because he saw a city hall official handing an envelope to the contractor, Tae-ryong. A young woman arrived with him, Cha Eun-ju, number 2831, a former idol trainee. Min-seok looked at her and saw nothing of the image that word conjures up. No makeup, nor the hairstyle, nor the pose. Just a 22-year-old girl with sharp cheekbones and alert eyes that moved quickly. Too quickly. She was scanning everything around her, the walls, the people, shadows, like radar. Eun-ju said she wanted to be useful. Min-seok asked what she could do. She replied that she could hear. Min-seok didn't understand. She explained. Perfect pitch. She can distinguish pitch with an accuracy of a quarter tone. She can hear hounds 200 meters away by their footsteps. She can tell how many there are by their rhythm. She knows the direction. Min-seok looked at her and thought about tuning forks, about a megaphone, about mourners, and about acoustic monitoring. A system that could be built around a person with perfect pitch. He said he was glad to have her. Eun-ju smiled, quickly, hesitantly, like someone who isn't used to being accepted for their skills rather than their appearance. Bricklayer Hwang turned out to be a godsend. He looked at Min-seok's walls and shook his head. He said the mortar was too weak, that the masonry was crooked, that the joints needed to be repointed. Min-seok didn't argue. He was an engineer, not a builder. Hwang was the builder. In 10 days, they erected a wall 1.5 meters high around the perimeter of the lighthouse. Not a fortress, but an obstacle. A hound wouldn't be able to jump over it. It would go around, but it wouldn't jump over it. The gate was made of stone slabs fastened with copper wire, heavy, sturdy. Min-seok stood before the finished wall and saw not a wall, but a beginning. The perimeter could be expanded, the height increased. Add observation decks, a moat, traps. But that would require more people, more hands, more materials. He looked north, toward Pak's camp. 28 men behind a fence of sharpened stakes. Sooner or later, he would have to resolve this issue. The solution came on its own. On the 49th day after Min-seok's landing, one of Pak's men ran up to the lighthouse, gasping for breath, covered in blood. He said that a pack of hounds had attacked the northern cape. A large pack, 10 or more. 2 killed. Pak was wounded. The fence was broken. They couldn't hold the camp. Min-seok didn't hesitate for a second. He grabbed a spear, 2 knives, and a megaphone. He shouted at Hwan to close the gate and not let anyone out. He ran north. Ji-woo ran after him. He didn't stop her. An hour and a half later, they were at the camp. The fence had been broken in 3 places. The bodies of 2 hounds lay at the entrance, impaled on wooden stakes. A human body lay between them. Inside the camp, it was chaos. People huddled against the rock in the center. Park stood before them with a baton in one hand. His other arm hung limply at his side, a dislocated shoulder or a fracture. 3 hounds roamed the camp. They were overturning tents and sniffing around, but they weren't attacking. They weren't hungry yet. They had come to establish dominance over the territory. Min-seok entered through the breach. The first hound turned toward him. He struck it with the horn. The sound sent it staggering back a step. It shook its head. The second one turned around. Min-seok hurled his spear. The bone plate tip pierced her neck just behind the ear, the only soft spot besides the submandibular area. The hound fell. The third one lunged at him. Min-suk stepped aside and struck with his knife under the jaw. That very same strike, 10,000 repetitions a night, 100,000 in a month. Perfect. The blade penetrated 7 centimeters and sliced through everything in its path. The hound collapsed at his feet. The first one recovered from the blow and lunged again. Ji-woo hurled a rock into its eye. She hit it. The hound yelped and recoiled. Min-suk finished it off with his knife. 3 bodies on the ground. The camp was silent. The people by the cliff stared at Min-suk, at his knife from which blood was dripping, at the horn in his other hand, at Ji-woo who stood behind him with a stone in each hand. Park Junil lowered his baton. He looked at the dead hounds. He looked at Min-suk, and for the first time in 2 years on the island, he said a word he had never said to any prisoner. "Thank you." Min-suk adjusted his shoulder. Park didn't make a sound. He just turned pale. Then Min-suk examined the wounded, 4 of them. Lacerations from claws, bruises, one had a concussion. He worked for 3 hours. He stitched up the wounds with a bone needle and thread made from hound tendons. He washed the wounds with boiled water. He plied bandages made of clean cloth. So-yun arrived an hour after him with a bag of mold and medical instruments. They worked side by side, in silence. 4 hands, 2 doctors. One real and one who had become real over the past month and a half on the island, because a system lived in his head that turned mistakes into skills faster than any medical school could. By evening, everyone had been treated. Min-suk sat by the fire and waited. Park approached. He sat down next to him. He was silent for 5 minutes. Then he said that Min-suk was right, that one by one they would all die, that the lighthouse and the Cape had to work together. Min-suk nodded. He asked on what terms. Park replied with just one. He would remain the commander of his own men. Min-suk would not command his fighters. Min-suk agreed. They shook hands. The first alliance on Hera Island. The alliance changed everything in 3 weeks. Park's men would come to the lighthouse for tools and leave with bone knives and spearheads. Min-suk taught 3 of them how to sharpen and work with bone. The system made him the perfect teacher. He saw every incorrect movement a student made just as clearly as he saw his own mistakes. The angle is wrong, the pressure is too strong, the hand wavered. He corrected them calmly and precisely. By the end of the first week, the 3 apprentices were making bone knives on their own. They were rougher than Min-suk's, but they were functional. Park sent 7 of them to work on building the wall around the lighthouse. Hwang supervised. The wall had grown to 2 meters high. The gate received a second leaf. The observation deck on the lighthouse became a permanent lookout post. Wonju stood watch there for 6 hours a day. She listened. She counted the hounds' footsteps in the forest. She determined their direction. Within a week, she could tell how many hounds were within a 300-meter radius and where they were heading. Min-suk listened to her reports and plotted their routes on a map. The map became covered with lines. Red marked the hounds, blue marked safe trails, green marked sources of water and food, yellow marked the weeping zones. On the 56th day after landing, Min-suk began building an acoustic system. The idea was simple. Bone resonators installed in the forest along the approaches to the lighthouse. Each was tuned to a specific frequency. When a hound passed by, it would brush against a fishing line tension cord. The tension cord would release a pendulum. The pendulum would strike the resonator. The sound travels toward the lighthouse. Wonju hears it. She determines which resonator was triggered based on the frequency. Based on the resonator, he determines the direction, an early warning system, primitive but effective. He assembled 12 resonators in 4 days. He placed them around the perimeter within a 200-meter radius of the lighthouse. He tuned each one to its own frequency ranging from 500 to 3,000 hertz in increments of 200. Wonju listened from the lighthouse platform and called out the numbers. 1st, southeast, 5th, north, 9th, west. Spot on every time. Min-suk looked at her and saw a person who had found her place. She was no longer a former idle trainee who had been cast out of the industry. She was the ears of the fortress. Without her, they were blind. He told her this that evening as they sat on the platform watching the sunset. Wunju laughed and said something light-hearted and playful. Then she fell silent. Then she said that no one had ever appreciated her for what she could do, only for her looks, for her voice on stage, for her face on camera. No one ever asked what she could hear. Min-suk replied that now they were asking. Wunju turned away toward the sea and remained silent for a long time. He didn't want to disturb her. The second month on the island. The lighthouse had turned into a base. 12 permanent residents, walls, gates, a sound system, fishing from 4 spots along the coast, a smokehouse for storage, a supply of dried hound meat. It turned out that hound meat is edible if cooked for a long time. Tough. It has an iron aftertaste, but it's high in calories. So-yeon organized the collection of mold and prepared the extract in batches. The antibiotic didn't always work, not against all infections, but it worked. The 3 people she saved from blood poisoning were living proof. Min-suk did what he always did. He solved problems, one after another. Water, a filter made of bone tissue, sand, and charcoal made it possible to use water from the northern stream. Light, the battery produced 2 volts. Min-suk assembled a simple circuit out of copper wire and a strand of hound hide soaked in fat. Not a light bulb, but a smoldering wick that burned steadily and for a long time. Better than a campfire indoors.
Heat, a clay stove in the outbuilding. Hwang built it in 2 days. Min-suk calculated the draft and the shape of the chimney so that the smoke would rise upward while the heat remained inside. That first evening, as they sat in a warm, dry room with even light and ate hot fish from clay bowls, Park Jun-il came by on business and stayed for dinner. He ate in silence. Then he got up and left without saying goodbye. Ji-woo said she'd seen his face, that he'd turned away when he took a bite of bread. Min-suk had baked it that morning in a clay oven, using flour he'd ground from the seeds of a local grain found on the southern slope. Coarse flour, coarse bread, but hot, fresh. Park hadn't eaten bread in 2 years. Ha-rin remained silent. Days passed, and she spoke only 2 or 3 words a day, in a whisper, only when asked. Min-suk didn't pressure her. He watched. She sat in the corner of the lab and watched him work for hours in silence. He counted aloud while he worked, a habit from MIT. Dimensions, proportions, angles, formulas. Ha-rin listened. Once, he made a mistake calculating the length of the resonator. He said aloud that 12 centimeters at a speed of sound of 340 meters per second would yield a frequency of 2,800 hertz. Ha-rin whispered that it wasn't right, that it would be 2,833. Min-suk stopped. He looked at her. He recalculated in his head. 340 divided by 0.12 divided by 2. 2,833. She was right. It took him half a second to recalculate. She had calculated it faster. Jae-hyun's daughter. A genius with numbers. Min-suk nodded and said she was right. Ha-rin didn't smile, but her shoulders straightened slightly, by a millimeter. Min-suk noticed. On the 63rd day, a woman Min-suk hadn't expected arrived at the lighthouse. Tall, broad-shouldered, calloused hands, short hair. A direct, intense gaze. Number 2824. She introduced herself as Park Ha-nu. Min-suk looked at the number, at the last name. He asked if she was Park Jun-il's sister. Ha-nu nodded. She said yes, that her brother didn't know she was on the island, that she'd been brought there 6 months after him, that she was a shipbuilding engineer, that she'd worked at the Taeryong shipyard in Goje, and that she had come not to see her brother, but to see Min-seok, because she'd heard about a man who makes things out of nothing. Min-seok asked why she hadn't gone to see her brother. Hanul replied that she didn't want to be the commander's sister. She wants to be an engineer. Min-seok looked at her hands, calluses from welding. The third month on the island began with a thunderstorm. It rained for 3 days. The wind tore the roofing shingles off the annex. Waves crashed against the rocks beneath the lighthouse, making the stone tremble. Min-seok sat in the lab, working by the light of a tallow wick. He was making a set of tools for So-yeon, the very same ones, tailored to her hands. The handles were 5 millimeters wider, and the blades were shorter, balanced toward the tip. 6 scalpels of various sizes, 2 clamps made of bent wire, a bone needle with an eye drilled through the tip of the blade, thread made from hound tendons, boiled and stretched to the thickness of sewing thread. He had been working for 2 days straight. The system recorded every movement in the background. By the morning of the 3rd day, the set was ready. He wrapped it in a clean cloth and brought it to So-yeon. She unwrapped it. She picked up the first scalpel. She placed it in a palm. She gripped it. She made a movement with her hand, an incision, an imaginary one. She paused. She looked at Min-seok. She asked how he knew that she needed exactly this kind of balance. Min-seok said he'd been watching her work for 3 weeks, every movement, every repositioning of the hand, the angle of her wrist, the length of her fingers, the force of her grip. So-yeon silently put the kit away. Then she said she had a younger brother, that he'd died of sepsis on a ship, that she hadn't had any antibiotics, that she'd treated him for 23 days with whatever she had, and it hadn't helped. That ever since then she'd lived with the feeling that her hands were useless, that tools don't matter if your hands can't save a life. Min-seok remained silent. So-yeon wiped her eyes and asked if he would teach her how to make an antibiotic, not an extract from mold, a real one, a synthesized one, a stable one. Min-seok said he would teach her, that it would require acid, heat, time, and patience, that it would take months. So-yeon said she had months to spare. The first inspection arrived on the 87th day. Min-seok found out about it 4 hours later. Unju heard the motorboat's engine from the lighthouse platform, a distant, steady rumble. It didn't sound like the sound of the surf. It didn't sound like the wind, a motor. Min-seok went upstairs and looked in the direction of the sound. Through the binoculars, which he didn't have, he couldn't see anything. But Unju said the sound was coming from the northeast, that it was a medium-tonnage diesel engine, that it was getting closer. Min-seok went back downstairs and sounded the alarm. Everyone take cover, put out the fires, close the gates, remove everything visible from the water. 2 hours later, a boat approached the eastern shore, a military-style boat, gray with a black stripe. On board were people in tactical gear, 6 of them. Assault rifles, body armor, helmets. A private military company. Min-seok was lying on the hilltop 200 meters away, watching. They landed on the beach. They set up their equipment, a laptop, an antenna, and cameras. One of them took out a tablet and began checking a list. Min-seok saw his face, Asian features, glasses, and a short haircut. Confident movements. The team leader. It was Daniel Cha. Min-seok didn't know his name, not yet anyway, but he remembered his face, the shape of his glasses, the way he held the tablet with his left hand, right-handed. Tablet in the left hand means the right hand is free for a weapon, a professional. The inspection lasted 2 days. The mercenaries combed the island. Min-seok led everyone away from the lighthouse. He spread them out across 3 locations in the forest that he had scouted in advance. He left the lighthouse empty but camouflaged. The gates were closed, traces were covered up. From the outside it looked like an abandoned ruin. The mercenaries walked past it. They didn't go inside. But one of them stopped by the wall and touched the masonry, fresh mortar. He looked at the lighthouse, then at his tablet. Then he walked on. Min-seok was lying in the bushes 30 meters away, not breathing.
On the second day, the mercenaries found 2 prisoners on the eastern shore, lone individuals, not part of a group. Min-suk heard 2 gunshots from half a kilometer away, short, buddy, then silence. He clenched his teeth. 2 people he didn't know and couldn't save. 2 names crossed off the list. By evening on the second day, the boat had left. Min-suk waited another 3 hours. Then he returned to the lighthouse. Everything was in place. Nothing had been touched. But one of the mercenaries had left something on a rock by the wall. A tablet, broken. The screen was cracked. The case was dented. It must have fallen off the cliff or been dropped while boarding the boat. Min-suk picked it up and carried it to the lab. A broken tablet isn't trash. It's a processor, memory, a screen, an antenna, a battery, parts. Min-suk took it apart over the course of 3 nights. The battery was still working, half a charge. The processor was intact, the memory. He connected power from the battery using scraps of wire. The screen flickered, streaks, artifacts, but he could make out the text through them. A map, ocean currents around Huron Island, depths, coordinates, patrol routes, and a list, prisoner numbers, statuses, alive, dead, unknown. Number 2847, status, unknown. Marked in red, priority target. A personal note from the client. Min-suk stared at the screen and saw his brother's hand. Min-ho hadn't forgotten. Min-ho had been waiting for confirmation of his death, and he hadn't received it. That meant the next time the inspection team came, they would be searching specifically for him. Number 2847. His number. He'd copied the current map onto a piece of bark. Ji-woo had traced it from the screen. The currents ran from south to north along the island's western coast. Strong currents, 3 to 4 knots. Hanyul's boat could use them. Head north toward the Korea Strait and then west toward Jeju or the mainland. But for that, he needed a motor. Sailing against the current is useless, and sailing with the current isn't enough in calm conditions. Min-suk put away his tablet and sat down on the floor. A motor. He needed a motor. There was no fuel, no spare parts, and no materials on the island for an internal combustion engine. But there was a battery. There was copper wire. There are magnets. He stood up. Magnets. Where on this island could he find magnets? He stepped out onto the open area and looked down at the wreckage of the boat. A dynamo. The generator in the boat. If the generator is intact, it contains permanent magnets. He climbed down to the wreckage. He found the generator, covered in rust and salt. He took it apart in 2 hours. Inside were 2 magnets, small but powerful, neodymium. They were stuck to the steel casing so tightly that he could barely pry them loose. An electric motor, copper wire, magnets, a shaft, a propeller. Everything could be put back together. Not powerful, not fast, but enough to move the boat. Min-suk returned to the lab with the magnets in his hands and smiled. For the second time in 3 months.
That evening, he sat with Hae-rin in the lab. She watched as he drew a diagram of the electric motor on a piece of bark. Winding, stator, rotor, commutator. A very simple design. Direct current from the battery flows through the winding to create a magnetic field. The field interacts with the permanent magnets. The rotor spins. The rotation is transmitted to the propeller via the shaft. The propeller pushes the water. The boat moves. Hae-rin looked at the diagram and whispered that the resistance of the winding depends on the length of the wire and its cross-sectional area. That at 2 volts and a wire length of more than 10 meters, the current would be too small to cause rotation. Min-suk stopped. She was right. 2 volts wasn't enough. More was needed. We need more battery cells, or we need another power source. Hae-rin said she'd read about bioelectric generators in her father's books, that some organisms produce electricity, electric eels, stingrays, that there might be similar creatures on the island.
Minsok looked at her. She was speaking, not in a whisper, quietly, but not in a whisper, in complete sentences, for the first time in a month. He nodded and said it was a good idea, that tomorrow they would go to the lake and check the fauna for electrical activity. Erin nodded. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The lake had a surprise in store. Minsok and Erin arrived at dawn. He'd brought 2 pieces of copper wire and connected them to what was left of the tester, a primitive voltmeter. He dipped the ends into the water a meter apart. The needle twitched, 0.2 volts. A weak current, but a current nonetheless. Something in the water was generating it. Minsok walked along the shore. He checked every 10 meters. The voltage fluctuated. The highest reading was in the northeast corner of the lake, 0.8 volts. He looked into the water. The bottom was dark, covered with something. Not rocks, not sand. Something alive. He stripped to the waist and waded knee-deep into the water. It was cold. The bottom felt soft under his feet. He bent down and scooped up a handful with his hand. He pulled out a handful, a dark green mass, dense, slippery, similar to algae, but not algae, a colony of microorganisms. He placed the mass on a rock and touched it with 2 wires. The needle jumped, 0.5 volts. This mass was generating electricity, a bioelectric mat, a colony of bacteria that produce an electric current as part of their metabolism. He'd read about them. Microbial fuel cells. Experimental technology. Laboratories around the world had been trying to scale them up for energy production. The results had been modest. But here on the island, he didn't need a megawatt. He needed 12 volts. Harin stood on the shore and watched. Minsuk came out of the water and said she was right, that a power plant lived in the lake, a small one, a biological one, but a power plant nonetheless. Harin allowed herself a smile, her first genuine one in a long time. For the next 2 weeks, he built the battery. He collected biomass from the lake. He arranged it in layers inside cells made from the shells of large eggs. The anode was copper, the cathode was bone charcoal, the electrolyte was diluted hound gastric juice. Each cell produced exactly 4 volts, weak, but when connected in series, the voltage added up. 10 cells, 4 volts, 30 cells, 12 volts. He assembled 30 cells in 8 days. The battery looked ridiculous, rows of eggshells filled with green slime connected by copper wire. But it produced 12 volts, enough for an electric motor. The current is weak, 50 milliamps. The motor would turn slowly. The propeller would provide little thrust, but it would provide some thrust. Minsuk brought the battery to Hanyul. She looked at it, at the eggshells, the green slime, the wires. Then she looked at Minsuk. She said that in her 15 years in shipbuilding, she'd never seen anything like it, and that it was either genius or madness. Minsuk replied that the difference between the two was determined by the result. Hanyul snorted. Minsuk recognized her brother's voice in that sound. The boat was taking shape. Hanyul worked 12 hours a day. The hull was made from the trunks of local trees, dense wood, heavy, but water-resistant. She hewn each plank with a stone axe with a blade made of bone. She fitted the tenon to the mortise so tightly that not even a hair could pass between them. Minsuk watched her work and saw a craftsmanship that was impossible to fake. Hands that know wood, know its shape, know its grain. Every strike was precise, every cut was in the right place. He asked why she had left the shipyard. Hanyul didn't answer right away. She worked in silence. Then she said she had built 3 ships she was proud of, a cargo ship for the fishing fleet, a patrol boat for the Coast Guard, a research vessel for the Oceanographic Institute. 3 fine ships. And then she found out that all 3 had been used by Terion for smuggling. Weapons. Chemicals. Parts for industries that shouldn't exist. Her ships. Her own handiwork. She started asking questions. She was told she'd better stop. She didn't stop. A month later, she was on the island. Min-seok listened in silence. Taeyong, his family, his surname. Every person on this island was here because Taeyong decided it was more convenient that way. He told Hanul that she would build one more ship, the last one, and that ship would bring all three of them back to her. Hanul didn't answer. She just struck the wood with her axe a little harder than necessary. The 4th month. The 120th day. The lighthouse's population had reached 20. Park's camp had shrunk to 18. People were leaving from Min-seok's camp not because he was calling them, but because the lighthouse offered food, warmth, medicine, and walls. Park held his ground. He didn't complain. He sent his men to work on construction and to hunt. The alliance was working, but the tension was mounting. Min-seok could feel it every time Park came to the lighthouse. Glances that lingered a second longer than necessary. Silences that weighed heavier than words. Park was a soldier, a commander. He was used to being first. And every day, the lighthouse reminded him that he was no longer first. Min-seok knew that sooner or later it would explode. The question was when. It exploded on the 130th day. Min-seok and 3 men were carrying logs for the boat along the trail from the forest to the lighthouse. They were met by 4 of Park's men. Silently, they blocked their path. The eldest among them said that Park was challenging Min-seok to a duel. Unarmed, one-on-one, in an open clearing by the lake. Min-seok lowered the log. He looked at the 4 men. He looked at his own men. He said he'd be there. In an hour. Ji-woo said it was a trap. Min-seok said no, that Park was a soldier, and that soldiers don't set traps. They arrange duels. So-yeon said he was an idiot, that Park was a military professional, hand-to-hand combat, 20 years of experience. Min-seok nodded. He said he knew, and that was exactly why he would win. The clearing by the lake. A circle. People on both sides. 18 from Park's side, 20 from the lighthouse. Park stood in the center, without a jacket. Muscles beneath tanned skin. Scars. Lots of scars. On his arms, on his chest, on his shoulders. A body that had fought 1,000 times and survived 1,000 times. Min-seok stepped out to face him. Next to Park, he looked like a teenager next to an adult. Not the same anymore. Not as skinny as on the first day. 3 months of hunting and hard work had built muscle over his bones. But he wasn't a fighter. He never had been. Park looked at him, and something like regret flashed in his eyes. He didn't want this. But he had to. Min-seok knew it. They both knew it. Park struck first, quickly, a straight punch to the head. Min-seok dodged, not faster than Park's punch, but at the exact moment the punch began. He saw it, not with his eyes, with the system. 4 months of observation. Every time Park moved, Min-seok memorized it, how he shifted his weight, how he rotated his hip before striking, how he tensed his shoulder, which hand he started with. Thousands of micro-observations. The system ran them all through, 1,000,000 repetitions, 1,000,000 simulations. Min-seok hadn't studied hand-to-hand combat. He'd studied Park. Park struck again, a left side punch. Min-seok stepped into the blow, intercepted the arm, spun around, a throw over his hip. Park fell onto his back, an exhale, a heavy thud against the ground. But he was a soldier. He sprang up in a second. He struck with his knee. Min-seok stepped back. He dodged. He didn't attack. He waited. Park struck again and again. Min-seok kept moving away, every time by a millimeter, every time a split second before the strike. He read Park like a book, like a code, like a sequence of instructions. If the right shoulder twitched, it meant a right straight. If the left hip moved back, it meant a left hook. If his weight shifted to his front leg, it meant a low kick. Park fought for 3 minutes, He didn't land a single hit. He stopped, breathing heavily, sweat on his face. And there was no anger in his eyes. There was understanding. He realized he wasn't missing, that Min-seok wasn't faster than him, that he simply knew every one of his strikes before it even began. Min-seok stood across from him, calm, breathing evenly. Not because he wasn't tired, because the system had optimized his breathing in such a way it had optimized his knife strike. Park lowered his hands. He looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded, once, briefly. He turned to his men and said that the lighthouse and North Cape were now one, that Min-seok was in command, that he, Park, remained the commander of the combat group as an officer under a new general, not as a slave, as an officer. Min-seok held out his hand. Park shook it, firmly. 38 men stood in the clearing by the lake and remained silent. Then someone clapped, then someone else, then silence. They weren't celebrating. They simply realized that authority had arrived on the island. Not that of the strongest, but the wisest. That evening, Min-seok sat alone on the lighthouse platform. Night, stars, the sea. He took out his tablet and turned it on. The screen flickered, lines, through them a map of the currents, and a list of numbers. He found the number he was looking for, not his own, number 2803. Lee So-yun. Status, alive, no note. Number 2819. Han Ji-woo. Status, unknown, no note. Number 2831. Cha Un-ju. Status, unknown, no note. Number 2824. Park Han-il. Status, dead. Min-seok read it again. Dead. Han-il is down there building a boat. But on the Blackstone list, she's dead. That means someone filed a false report. Someone covered for her. The same bodyguard who hid Hae-rin. Or someone else. Min-seok turned off his tablet. He lay on his back. He looked up at the stars. 130 days on the island. 4.5 months. 17.5 left. Min-ho is preparing for the IPO. Min-seok is preparing his return. The question was, who would finish first? The 5th month, Haran Fortress. That's what they now called the lighthouse and everything around it. 38 people behind a stone wall 2.5 meters high. A moat 1 meter deep ran along the perimeter. At the bottom were sharpened stakes made of bone plates, 2 gates. The northern ones led to the forest. The southern ones led to the shore. The lighthouse's observation deck operated around the clock. Un-ju and 2 guards she had trained took turns listening for sounds in the forest. An acoustic system consisting of 20 resonators covered an area within a 300-meter radius. Not a single hound could approach unnoticed. The vegetable garden. Min-seok had laid it out on the southern slope behind the wall. A hydroponic system made from scraps of plastic and wooden gutters. Water from the lake flowed through a system of bamboo pipes. Not bamboo, a local plant similar to bamboo. Hollow, durable, flexible. He found it in the 3rd month and had been using it for everything ever since. Pipes, handles, frames. The garden grew grain seeds from the southern slope and root vegetables that Hae-rin had gathered when she lived alone in the forest. Small, bitter, but nutritious. So-yun determined that they were high in starch and vitamin C.
Min-seok developed a system for irrigation and fertilization using ash from the furnace. A month later, the first harvest. Small, but their own. The smithy. Hwang built it out of stone against the north wall, a clay furnace, bellows made of hide and wooden frames, coal from local trees. The temperature wasn't high enough to melt steel, but it was sufficient for working with copper and for hardening bone plates. Min-seok discovered that when heated to a certain temperature, the hound's bone plates became even harder, just like hardened steel. The structure changed. He didn't know exactly what chemistry was behind it, but the result was consistent.
The hardened plates didn't break even when struck with a hammer. They were used to make knives, spearheads, scalpels, and shields for the guards. Pak Junil trained a combat unit, 12 people, men and women, armed with spears and bone knives. Formations, movement, ambushes. Park was in his element. He couldn't invent things, but he could command. And the people he trained were different, not a mob with sticks, a unit with weapons and tactics. The pharmacy. So-yun worked there every day. Min-seok had taught her the process of extracting an antibacterial substance from mold. She had refined it. She added a filtration step using bone tissue, then an evaporation step, then a concentration stage. By the 5th month, she had a stable extract that worked 8 times out of 10. Not penicillin, but close. She stored it in glass test tubes carved from the wreckage of the boat's dashboard. 12 test tubes in a row on the shelf, each one labeled date, concentration, results. So-yun kept records like a real researcher, because she was a real researcher. It's just that her lab was a stone room on an island in the East China Sea. Min-seok was working on a radio, parts from a tablet, an antenna made of copper wire, a wooden casing, a battery made of bioelectric cells. He'd been assembling it for 3 weeks. The system ran through every circuit, every contact, every connection. Electronics wasn't his specialty, but he'd taken a basic course at MIT. 1 course, 16 lectures. The system had turned them into practical knowledge over the course of 2 nights of migraines and 1 nosebleed. He assembled the transmitter on the 150th day, frequency 156.8 megahertz, marine band, channel 16, the International Distress Channel. He went out to the lighthouse platform at night, connected the antenna,
Turned on the transmitter. Noise, crackling, static. He adjusted the tuning, slowly, by a micron. 3 minutes in, a voice broke through the static, distant, distorted. Korean. No, not Korean. A North Korean dialect. A fisherman. He was cursing at someone for getting his net caught in the propeller. Min-seok listened and held his breath. A human voice from the outside world, the first in 5 months. He didn't respond, not yet. First, he needed to figure out who else was listening to this frequency. Blackstone might be monitoring. Min-ho might be monitoring. One careless broadcast, and the next inspection would arrive not with 6 mercenaries, but with 20. He turned off the drist and went downstairs. He sat down in the lab. He thought. He needed a connection to the mainland, but a secure one, encrypted. Or a one-time connection, 1 message to 1 person. Who? He ran through names in his head. Friends from MIT, colleagues from Taeyong Bio, lawyers, journalists. No, none of them would accept a signal from a private prison island without proof. He needed someone who already knew, someone who didn't need an explanation. Jae-hyun. Jae-hyun knew. Jae-hyun is dead, but Jae-hyun had friends, college friends, old friends, trustworthy ones. Hae-rin must know their names. He came to see Hae-rin that morning. She was sitting in a corner, counting something on a piece of bark, scratching numbers with a bone awl. Min-seok sat down next to her and asked if she remembered her father's friends. Hae-rin stopped. She looked at him. She said she remembered one, Professor Kim Tae-hyun, Department of Neuroscience at Seoul National University, a friend of her father's from graduate school. He used to come over for dinner every month. He'd bring her books. Min-seok asked if she knew his contact information. Hae-rin shook her head, but she said she knew where he lived, Gwanak-gu district, near the university, a house with a blue roof on a hill. Min-seok nodded. That was enough. Not for a radio signal, for a letter, a paper letter that someone would deliver to the address. All that remained was to find someone who could leave the island. The 6th month, the 2nd inspection. Min-seok was ready. Unju heard the engine 6 hours in advance, further away than last time.
because Min-suk had set up 3 acoustic repeaters on the eastern shore. Bone horns pointed toward the sea. Any sound from the water was amplified and carried all the way to the lighthouse.
Unju sounded the alarm. Min-suk ordered the standard procedure: extinguish the lights, close the gates, camouflage the walls with branches and mud. Everyone into the forest via 3 routes. But this time, he wasn't going to just hide. He took Park and 4 fighters with him. They took cover on the hill above the eastern beach. The boat approached the shore. The same one, gray with a black stripe. But there were more people. 10, not 6. Minho had increased the budget. The team leader was the same: glasses, a left-hander with a tablet, a right-hander with a weapon. Daniel Cha. Min-suk now knew his name. He'd found it in the tablet's files. Daniel Cha, 34 years old, citizen of the United States and the Republic of Korea, former Marine, founder of Blackstone Peninsula Security, contract with the Taeryong Group to provide security for the Haerang facility. Personal contact, Kang Min-ho. Min-suk watched as Cha issued orders. Clear, concise. 10 men split into 3 groups. 2 headed deeper into the island. 1 remained by the boat. Cha went with the second group, south, toward the lighthouse. Min-suk tensed. Last time, they'd just passed by. This time, Cha was heading straight for it. He knew. Someone had told him. Or maybe he'd figured it out himself from the fresh masonry that his man had touched last time. Cha's group reached the lighthouse 2 hours later. Min-suk watched them from above on the hill. 4 mercenaries, Cha in the lead. They inspected the wall, the gate, the moat. Cha crouched down and felt the stakes in the moat. He looked at the bone plates. He stood up. He took off his glasses, wiped them, put them back on. He looked at the lighthouse. He said something to his men. Min-suk couldn't hear him, but he saw their reaction. The mercenaries closed in, weapons at the ready. They hadn't expected to see a fortified position. They'd expected feral prisoners in pits. Cha walked around the wall. He found a camouflaged section where branches covered fresh masonry. He pushed the branches aside. He looked. He turned to his men and shook his head. They left. They didn't go in. They didn't break down the gate. They just left. Min-suk didn't understand. Then he realized. Cha isn't a fool. He saw the fortress and realized there wasn't just one person inside. There was a group inside, an organized one. Armed, with engineering know-how. Storming it with just 4 men without reconnaissance would be suicide. He'll be back. With a larger group, with proper preparation. Min-suk had time, but not much. The inspection team left by evening on the second day. This time, Min-suk tracked the boat from the top of the lighthouse. The boat was heading northeast toward the mainland, speed about 20 knots. The distance to the shore, according to the map on the tablet, was 380 kilometers. That was a 19-hour trip on Hanil's electric motorboat, assuming the motor could maintain 4 knots and the battery would hold out. A lot of ifs. But the numbers were there, and numbers are a start. Min-suk went down to the lab and sat down to do the calculations. Harin sat down next to him. They calculated together. Battery capacity, motor power consumption, current speed, wind direction, range. Harin calculated in her head faster than Min-suk could on paper. She found errors in his calculations before he even finished a line. Jae-hyun's daughter, a living calculator. By nightfall, they had a route. The southern coast of the island. The current catches the boat and carries it northwest. The engine adjusts the course. Jeju in 15 hours. From there, a ferry to Mokpo. From there, a bus to Seoul. If everything goes perfectly. Nothing will go perfectly. But they had a route. The 7th month, a woman no one was expecting arrived at the lighthouse. An American, Korean by blood. Her business suit was muddy and torn. Her shoes were gone. She was barefoot. Her face was scraped.
Her arms were bruised. She emerged from the forest on the eastern shore and collapsed at the fortress gate. Park picked her up and carried her to So-Yun. Her name, Jennifer So, a lawyer from New York. She came to 4 hours later. She drank water and told her story. She had come to Haerong as part of the Environmental Commission of the Underwriter Bank for the Taeryong IPO, a formal pre-placement inspection. The island was listed as a nature reserve in the documents. She was supposed to sign the inspection report and fly back. But she saw something she wasn't supposed to. Bones on the beach, numbers on jackets, prisoners in the forest. She started asking questions. They told her it was part of an environmental project, volunteers. She didn't believe them. She took out her phone. She started filming. They took her phone away. They led her to a boat. But not the one that had brought her there. Another one that was heading back to the island, without a return ticket.
Blackstone decided it was easier to leave her there than to explain her disappearance in New York. She spent 2 weeks on the island, hiding in the woods. She ate whatever she could find. Then she heard the sound of a hammer coming from the lighthouse and followed the sound. Min-suk listened to her and didn't see a victim. He saw a weapon, a corporate lawyer from New York, a witness, a living witness who had come to the island from the underwriting bank and could confirm that the nature reserve was a prison. This wasn't just testimony, it was the collapse of the IPO. He asked Jennifer what she knew about the structure of the deal. Jennifer looked at him in surprise. She had just nearly died in the woods, and he was asking about the structure of the deal. Then she saw his eyes, calm, calculating, the eyes of a man with a plan. She answered. She knew everything, the structure, the banks, the jurisdictions, the deadlines, the terms. She had spent 3 months preparing the documentation. Min-suk listened and jotted down every detail on a piece of bark. Every detail, every name, every date. By morning, he had a complete map of Taeryong's IPO, and he knew where to strike. Jennifer surveyed the fortress the next day. The walls, the laboratory, the apothecary, the smithy, the vegetable garden. Hanil's boat on the slipway by the shore. She walked in silence. Then she stopped in front of Min-suk and said that during her 10 years in corporate law, she'd defended companies like Taeryong, that she had drawn up deals that turned a blind eye to things like this island, that she'd been part of the machine. Min-suk said that now she could be part of another machine, a machine that would break the first one. Jennifer asked what he needed. Min-suk replied that he needed a legal package, documents that would derail the IPO and open a criminal case against Kang Min-ho in U.S. jurisdiction. Jennifer said that for that, they needed evidence, physical evidence, witness testimony, and documents. Min-suk said he had a Blackstone tablet with a map of the island and a list of prisoners. There are 38 living witnesses. And then there's her, the lawyer who came from the underwriter and saw everything with her own eyes. Jennifer was silent for a minute. Then she said that would be enough. Barely, but enough. They got to work. The 8th month. An epidemic. A new hound brought back a parasite, a large specimen that pox fighters had killed on the northern trail. They butchered the carcass and brought the meat back to the fortress. 2 days later, 7 of them fell ill, fever, vomiting, and stomach pain. So-Yun examined them all, identical symptoms, the same source, the meat. A parasite in the hound's muscle tissue, not the usual kind, a new one. She found the larvae under a microscope. Min-suk had cobbled together a microscope from the glass of a tablet and the lens from a pair of glasses he'd found in the wreckage of the boat. Rough, 20 times magnification, but enough to see the white threads in the tissue sample. A parasite, a roundworm. Larval stage in the muscles, adult stage in the intestines. Classic trichinella or something similar. Antibiotics won't help. An anti-helminthic drug is needed, which we don't have. So-Yun said that without treatment, the parasite migrates from the intestines to the organs, the liver, the lungs, the brain. Death in 2 or 3 weeks. Among the 7 was a boy, 12 years old.
They'd found him on the eastern beach a month ago, alone, no room number, no jacket. No one knew how he'd ended up on the island. He didn't talk about it. He'd just turned up at the fortress. He helped out in the garden, carried water, quiet, unobtrusive. Now he lay on a mat, burning up, a temperature of 41. His stomach was swollen, his eyes were cloudy. Min-suk sat nearby and thought. An anthelmintic, something that kills parasites, not bacteria, parasites. Multicellular ones, with a nervous system, with muscles. Poison. He needed a poison that would kill the worm but not the host, a therapeutic window, a dose that's lethal to the parasite but safe for humans. He stood up and left the pharmacy. He went to the lab. He laid out everything he had in front of him: mold, hound bile, gastric juice, root extract, local berry juice, tree bark, leaves, roots. Soo-yeon came over and sat down next to him. They went through the options one by one. Berry juice, toxic but non-selective. It would kill both the worm and the patient. Hound bile, antibacterial, not antiparasitic. Bark. Soo-yeon paused. She said that in traditional medicine, the bark of certain trees was used as a vermifuge, bitter bark containing alkaloids. Min-suk looked at the samples. Among them was a piece of bark from a tree that grew by the lake. Bitter, sharply bitter. He'd chewed on it a week ago out of curiosity and spit it out because of the taste. Bitterness meant alkaloids. Alkaloids meant biological activity.
He ground the bark into a powder, poured boiling water over it, strained it. A dark brown liquid with a smell that made his eyes water. He didn't know exactly what was in it. He didn't know the dosage. But the boy was dying. Min-suk hadn't slept for 3 days. He gave the decoction in small doses. He watched for a reaction. The first dose caused vomiting. The second went down fine. The third. The fourth. He increased the dose by 1 gram every 6 hours. He monitored his pulse, his temperature, and the color of his skin. So-yeon kept watch by his side. They took turns. One would sleep for an hour while the other stayed awake, then they'd switch. On the second day, the boy's temperature dropped by 1 degree. On the third day, he began to sweat profusely. The fever was breaking. His stomach became softer. By the morning of the 4th day, the boy was asleep. He wasn't tossing and turning. He wasn't moaning. His breathing was steady. 18 breaths per minute. Min-suk was sitting next to him on the floor. A syringe made of hollow bone with a wooden plunger was clenched between his fingers. He had fallen asleep sitting up, his head resting on the edge of the cot. So-yeon found them both in the morning. The boy had rosy cheeks. Min-suk had the syringe in his hand. She closed the door quietly. She didn't wake them. She went outside. People were standing by the door, the entire fortress, in silence. No one went in. They just stood there, waiting. So-yeon said the boy would live. No one clapped. No one shouted. Someone exhaled. Someone sat down on the ground. Someone turned away. Park Jun-il stood against the wall with his arms crossed over his chest, staring at the sky. His lips were moving. Maybe he was counting. Maybe he was praying. Min-suk woke up 2 hours later. He stepped out of the pharmacy. He squinted against the sun. He saw the people at the door. He didn't understand why they were standing there. So-yeon said they had been waiting. Min-suk asked for what. So-yeon replied, "For you." The other 6 were treated using the same regimen. They all survived. The decoction made from bitter bark became the second medicine at So-yeon's pharmacy, an antibiotic made from mold, an antihelminthic made from bark. 2 medicines, 2 lives saved. So-yeon stood by the shelf of test tubes and looked at them. 12 test tubes of antibiotic, 8 jars of antihelminthic. She turned to Min-suk and said that for the first time in 5 years, she felt like her hands were working, that they were doing what they were meant to do. Min-suk didn't reply. He stood by the window and looked out at the sea. 5 years ago, So-yeon's brother had died of sepsis.
because there were no antibiotics. Now there were antibiotics, made by her own hands, from mold found on an island in the East China Sea. He didn't tell her that. He didn't need to. She knew it herself. The 10th month. Hanyul's boat was taking shape. The hull was 4 meters long, wooden, sheathed with bone plates below the waterline. The mast was made from a single tree trunk. The sail was made of sewn-together hides impregnated with fat to make them water-resistant. The rudder was a bone plate mounted on a wooden tiller. Min-suk finished the electric motor in the 9th month. Copper windings on a wooden frame, 2 neodymium magnets. The shaft was made from a steel bolt found in the boat. The propeller was carved by Hanul from a bone plate. 4 blades. The angle of attack was 12 degrees. She calculated it using formulas she remembered from the shipyard. Harin checked it. Everything matched. The motor ran at 80 revolutions per minute. Not enough for a real boat. Enough for theirs. 4 knots with a favorable current. A 40-cell battery. A range of 20 hours. If they caught the current off the southern shore, it would be enough to reach Jeju. The 12th month. The 3rd inspection. 15 mercenaries, 2 boats. Cha had brought reinforcements. Min-suk had been waiting for this. Half a year had passed since Cha first saw the fortress. Enough time to prepare. Min-suk had prepared as well. 3 lines of defense. The first, traps in the forest along the approaches to the lighthouse. Pits with stakes camouflaged with branches. Traps made of fishing line tied to megaphones. When a mercenary touches the line, the megaphone strikes a tuning fork. A sound at the frequency of a wailing woman echoes through the forest. It doesn't kill, it doesn't maim, but it disorients. Second line, a wall, a moat. Paka's fighters with spears take their positions. Third line, Min-suk with a horn on the lighthouse platform, but they never made it to the 3rd line. Cha's mercenaries entered the forest and fell into the traps. 2 of them fell into the pits. 1 broke his leg. The tripwires were triggered and the forest filled with the wail of tuning forks.
The sound, at a frequency of 2,000 hertz, echoed off the trees and rocks, creating chaos. The mercenaries couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. They lost their bearings. The 3 groups scattered in different directions. One group ended up in the territory of the mourners. Min-suk hadn't planned for this, but the mourners couldn't tell friend from foe. 2 mercenaries returned to the beach with blood streaming from their ears and cracked ribs. Cha recalled the group. By evening, both boats had left. Min-suk stood on the lighthouse platform and watched them go. Cha will return, with even greater force. Or he won't return. It depends on what Minho decides. The 14th month. Fort Iran, 60 residents. Stone walls 3 meters high around the entire perimeter, 4 watchtowers, a laboratory, a pharmacy, a blacksmith's shop, a hydroponic garden, a smokehouse, a bakery, a school. Yes, a school. Min-suk started it in the 11th month. He taught children and adults, those who had forgotten, how to read and write. He taught math, physics, the basics of medicine. Harin taught math better than he did. She stood in front of a group of 7 people and explained fractions. Her voice was quiet but steady, no longer a whisper. Jennifer taught English. Soyeon taught first aid. The fortress was not a prison, not a survival camp. It was a city, a small one, on a cliff in the East China Sea, but a city nonetheless, with laws, with medical care, with education, with a plan. The 15th month. Min-suk made a decision. A pregnant woman, one of the fortress's residents, 7 months along. Giving birth on the island is dangerous. Soyeon could deliver the baby, but if there were complications, a C-section without anesthesia, without a sterile operating room, without a blood transfusion, that would be murder, not surgery. The woman had to be taken off the island. Min-suk discussed it with Hanul. The boat was ready. The engine was running. The battery was charged. The route has been mapped out. But the boat is designed for 1 person, 2 at most. 1 person will take the woman.
There were 3 volunteers. Min-suk chose Hwan, a former bricklayer, strong, dependable. He knew Busan, he knew the coastline. He knew how to handle himself if a patrol stopped them. Min-suk gave him a letter, just one, sealed in plastic from a tablet. The address, Professor Kim Tae-hyun, Gwanak-gu, the house with the blue roof on the hill. The letter was 3 pages long. Facts, the island's coordinates, the prisoners' names, the name Kang Min-ho, and a request.
Don't go to the police. Don't go to the journalists. Wait. Wait for the man who will come in person, who will show the evidence, who will explain the plan. Hwang nodded. He took the letter. The woman got into the boat. Small, wooden, sheathed in monster bones, with a motor made of wire and magnets, with a battery made of eggshells and green slime. Night. High tide. The current flowing from south to north. The boat slipped quietly away from the shore. The motor hummed barely audibly. Unju stood on the tower and listened until the sound dissolved into the roar of the surf. She said, "That's it. He's gone." The 22nd month. Night. Haran Pier. The very same one from which Min-soka had been taken 2 years ago. Now the pier was different, reinforced, expanded, with mooring cleats made of bone pillars. A boat was docked at the pier, not the small one they'd used to take the pregnant woman away. A second one, larger, 6 meters. Han-il had spent 8 months building it. The hull was made of select timber, laminated with resin from local trees. The plating consisted of hardened bone plates, 2 sails. The motor was powered by 3 batteries. 12 knots with a favorable wind and current. Han-il stood on the pier and gazed at her creation. Min-sok stood beside her. Behind them stood the entire fortress, 60 men, silent. Torches burned along the wall, casting orange shadows on the stone. 2 years, 730 days. From the number on his jacket to this night. Min-sok looked over at the people standing behind him. Every face, every name, every story. He knew them all. So-yun stood closest to him. In her hands was a folder, a thick one, wrapped in plastic. Medical records. 2 years of work. Every patient, every diagnosis, every medication. Evidence that people were living on the island, held there against their will, and that they needed medical care that had been denied to them. Next to her was Ji-woo, translated letters from her father, a National Assembly member, who had been blackmailed and who had resisted until the very end. Min-sok had recovered the correspondence from the Blackstone Tablets files 3 months ago. Ji-woo read them and cried for the first time in a year and a half. Then she wiped her eyes and said she now knew what to do. Unju was holding a hard drive in her hands, or rather, what served as a hard drive, the tablet's memory containing recordings of Blackstone's negotiations, coordinates, inspection dates, names, and amounts. Min-sok spent 18 months decrypting the files. The system helped. The encryption was military grade, but not perfect. Han-il held the key to the boat, a simple wooden key that fit into the ignition lock, which she had made herself. She handed it to Min-sok. He took it. Jennifer So stood slightly to the side. In her hands was a stack of sheets. Bark, neatly trimmed, covered in fine handwriting on both sides. 400 pages of legal documents. The structure of the lawsuit, a list of violations, a list of witnesses, jurisdiction, procedure. Every paragraph was carefully crafted. Every reference was verified. She had been working on this for 6 months. She told Min-sok a week ago that this was the best work of her life, because for the first time in her life, she was working for the truth and not for a fee. Hae-rin was standing at the back, small, quiet, holding a flash drive. The small, black flash drive that Min-sok had found in the lining of Hae-rin's jacket last May. Sewn in, hidden by the bodyguard who had taken her off the mainland. On the flash drive was Dr. So Jae-hyun's work. Complete. Finished.
The neural interface, algorithms, data, a prototype ready for patenting. Min-sok didn't open the files until the 16th month. He couldn't. He wasn't ready. When he finally opened them, he sat motionless in the lab for 3 hours, because among the files, he found a folder named Ming-sok. Inside was a single recording, a voice recording. Jae-hyun, his voice, calm, tired. He said he had implanted the interface prototype into Min-sok under the guise of a routine medical examination, a week before it happened. He didn't say the word death. He said it before what was going to happen actually happened. He knew. He knew that Minho would come for him. He knew he wouldn't survive. And he did the only thing he could. He left his work inside the only person he trusted, the infinite practice system. Not a reward from heaven, not a gift from the island, the final gift from a dead friend. A training algorithm within which Min-sok found fragments of Jae-hyun's neural network, a replica, not consciousness, not a soul, a pattern, the shadow of the teacher within the student.
Every time the system honed a skill in his sleep, Min-sok worked alongside Jae-hyun. Every night, for 2 years. Min-sok sat in the lab with his eyes closed, listening to his friend's voice over and over. Then he turned off the recording. He stood up. He went out onto the lighthouse platform. He looked out at the sea. He said quietly that he understood everything, and that he would finish the job. Hae-rin handed him a flash drive. Min-sok took it, a small plastic rectangle, worth more than the entire Taeryong group. The technology Min-ho had tried to stop at all costs. Alive, working, inside Min-sok's head and on this flash drive. He tucked it into his inside pocket, zipped it up. He looked at Hae-rin. She was looking up at him. Dark eyes, quiet, not empty. They hadn't been empty for a long time. During her year in the fortress, she had grown. Not physically, inside. She spoke, not in a whisper, quietly but in her own voice. She laughed. Rarely, but she laughed. The first time was when she found an error in Min-sok's calculations, and he admitted she was right. She taught math. She helped So-yeon calculate dosages. She was part of the fortress, part of the family. Jae-hyun's daughter. Min-sok turned to the people and said 3 words. I'll be back. Hold the fortress. Park Jun-il gave a brief nod. That was enough. Park would hold it. 2 years ago, he didn't trust Min-sok. Now he would give his life for him. Not because Min-sok was stronger, because Min-sok had built a world where strength wasn't the most important thing. Min-sok stepped toward the pier. He stopped. He turned back. He approached Hae-rin. He embraced her. For the first time in 2 years. She froze for a second. Then she hugged him back, tightly. He leaned down and whispered in her ear so softly that no one could hear. Your father left me everything he knew. I'll give it all back to you. Everything. She nodded. He let her go, turned around, walked along the dock, his footsteps on the wood. Steady, quiet. He got into the boat, started the engine. A quiet hum. The propeller spun. The boat pulled away from the dock. It turned its bow northward. Min-sok didn't look back. Not because he didn't want to. Because if he looked back, he wouldn't be able to leave. Because behind him stood the house he had built with his own hands out of bones and stones and mold and iron and people. And leaving home hurts, even if you're leaving to save it.
Unju climbed up to the lighthouse's observation tower.
She turned on the microphone connected to the system Min-suk had built for her. Speakers on the fortress walls, bone horns pointed inward. She took a deep breath and began to sing, an old Korean song, quiet, slow. Her voice echoed through the fortress, along the shore and across the water. The boat was heading north. The song followed it. Min-suk heard it. He closed his eyes for a second. He opened them. Ahead lay the sea. Behind him was the island. The sun was rising over the island. 3 months later, Seoul, Taryong Tower. The 42nd floor, the boardroom, a long black wood table, 12 chairs, 9 people at the table. Lawyers, executives, financiers. At the head of the table sat Kang Min-ho, 32 years old, a $5,000 suit, a $50,000 watch. The confident smile of a man who, in 2 weeks, will ring the bell at the new and become untouchable. He spoke about the roadshow schedule, about meetings with investors, about the target valuation of $16 billion. Everything was going according to plan. Every detail was in place. Every witness had been eliminated. Every document had been cleaned up. The island was operational. Blackstone was operational. Min-suk was dead. Number 2847 hadn't been in contact for 2 years. Cha confirmed that the fortress on the island had been destroyed by a storm 4 months ago. No one survived. Min-ho believed it because he wanted to believe it. The door to the hall opened. The secretary peeked in and said a visitor had arrived, unannounced. Min-ho grimaced and said he was busy. The secretary hesitated. She said the visitor had given his name, Kang Min-suk. Silence. 9 pairs of eyes turned toward the door. Min-ho turned pale for a single second. Then he regained his composure. He told her to let him in. The door opened. Min-suk walked in. A suit, not an expensive one, clean, tailored by So-yeon from whatever she could find on the mainland. A white shirt, boots, a short haircut, a tanned face. His hands were different. Not the hands of an engineer who sat at a computer. The hands of a man who, for 2 years, had cut through bones and rocks and hides, assembled engines, built walls, dissected monsters, and healed people. Strong, calm, precise. He sat down in the empty chair across from Min-ho. He placed a flash drive on the table. Next to it was So-yeon's folder. Next to that were Jennifer's documents. Next to them were Unju's notes. Next to them were letters from Ji-woo's father. 4 stacks, 1 USB drive, and silence. Min-ho looked at him. 2 years. The last time he'd seen his younger brother in the office was when the lawyers slipped him the papers. Quiet, polite, submissive. The man sitting across from him now was not quiet. He was not submissive. He was calm. That's different. The silence of strength, not the silence of weakness. Min-ho asked how. 1 word. Min-suk didn't answer the question. He said the flash drive contained Dr. So Jae-hyun's work, a neural interface, a working prototype patented 3 weeks ago through Professor Kim Tae-hyun. The patent belongs to Jae-hyun's heiress, Yoon Hae-rin, who is alive, whom Min-ho tried to kill. According to estimates by 3 independent laboratories, the value of the patent exceeds the market value of the entire Taryong group. So-yeon's folder contains the medical records of 38 prisoners on Haeran Island, including evidence of torture and murder. Jennifer's documents the structure of a lawsuit filed in the jurisdictions of New York State and Delaware. Unju's records contain intercepted communications from Blackstone Peninsula with direct orders from Kang Min-ho to eliminate witnesses. Ji-woo's father's letters contain evidence of blackmail against a National Assembly member. Min-ho sat and listened. His expression didn't change. He was a chaebol. He knew how to hide his feelings. But his hands, Min-suk watched his hands. His fingers were clenched around the edge of the table. His knuckles were white. The 9 people at the table sat motionless. Min-ho's lawyers were already doing the math in their heads.
Min-seok could see it in their eyes. They weren't figuring out how to save Min-ho. They were figuring out how to distance themselves from him as quickly as possible. Min-seok said that Min-ho had a choice. The first, the IPO is cancelled. Min-ho signs a voluntary transfer of control over Taeryong Group to a board under external administration. Haerong Island is handed over to the authorities. The prisoners are released. Compensation is paid. Min-ho leaves the company. No criminal case, no public scandal, quietly, just the way he likes it. Option 2. Min-seok hands over all the materials to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York and the Prosecutor General's Office of the Republic of Korea simultaneously. The IPO isn't just cancelled, it becomes the biggest corporate scandal in Korean history. Min-ho doesn't leave. Min-ho goes to prison. Min-ho looked at his brother, the quiet boy who had always yielded to him, who signed the papers in 6 hours, whom he had sent to his death. Min-seok looked at his brother, the man who killed Jae-hyun,
who sent Hae-rin to her death, who turned the island into a prison, who ruined the lives of 60 people for the sake of a single line on a stock market terminal. Min-ho asked what he had chosen. Min-seok replied that the choice wasn't his, it was Min-ho's. He stood up. He left the documents on the table, turned toward the door, stopped. Without turning around, he said that Jae-hyun had left him something, not a flash drive, not a patent, something inside, and that this something works every night, and that every night it works alongside the man Min-ho killed, and that this work will never end. Min-ho didn't answer. Min-seok walked out of the room. The door closed behind him. He went down to the first floor. He left the Taeryong Tower and stepped out onto Gangnam Street. Evening. Lights, cars, people, coffee shops, neon signs. The world he'd left 2 years ago. The same, yet different. He stood on the sidewalk and breathed in the city air. Gasoline, coffee, perfume, asphalt after the rain. The phone in his pocket vibrated. A message from Jennifer. 2 words. He read it. Min-seok put the phone away. He looked up at the sky. You can barely see the sky over Seoul. Too much light. On the island, the stars were huge, close, as if he could reach out and touch them. He took out his second phone. He dialed the number. Unju picked up on the second ring. He said 1 word. Done. Silence on the other end, then voices, many voices, distant, quiet. He heard someone crying, someone laughing, Park telling everyone to be quiet. He heard Hae-rin say she knew, that she'd known from the very beginning. Min-seok smiled. For the 3rd time in 2 years, the thread at the back of his neck hummed quietly and steadily, like a heartbeat, like the voice of a friend who would never leave. He put the phone in his pocket and walked down the street. There was a lot of work ahead, liberating the island, the trial, compensation, Jae-hyun's patent, Hae-rin's future, the future of the 60 people who would become his family. But that was for later. Right now, he was walking through Gangnam in a suit tailored by a doctor from fabric found on the monster island. And behind him, there was nothing. No room number, no jacket, no cell. Just the city, and the evening, and the road home.